So at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are switched off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 6 on the agenda. Before we begin, we will just record our decision in private session on EU scrutiny, Schedule A, Colm 2018-636, which is the proposal for a regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council amending Regulation EU Euratom number 1141/2014 as regards a verification procedure related to the infringements of rules on the protection of personal data in the context of elections to the European Parliament. It is proposed that this proposal does not warrant further scrutiny. Is that agreed? Thank you. So item number 7 is appropriate use of land, and today's meeting will be split into 2 sessions and will involve consideration of the appropriate use of public land. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome to our first session from the Land Development Agency, Mr John Coleman, and from the Department, Mr Niall Cousins. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Mr Coleman for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. And Chair and members, I thank you for your invitation to attend your committee meeting today, and I look forward to an ongoing positive and constructive engagement between the committee and the Land Development Agency. I'll briefly outline the LDA's strategic objectives and how we plan to make a lasting positive change to how we use land in Ireland, and that's both state land and privately held land, and to improve and stabilise housing supply over the long term. I'll then update you on some of the initial progress made by the LDA since its inception just 1 month ago. And on the LDA's mandate and objectives, its mandate is to expedite the delivery with a focus on housing of land that could and should be developed or redeveloped, whether state-owned or privately owned. And we will do this in 2 ways: optimising how we use lands in the control of the state sector with a focus on housing supply, and opening up large-scale strategic land banks, including privately held land, to ensure faster and better coordinated delivery of land and homes in the future. These 2 objectives are interrelated. The state may have land interests that are large-scale and strategic in their own right, or that may form part of a larger strategic area. However, it is important to state that we're not limiting our focus to where the state has land interests. We're also examining the potential to unlock delivery on wholly privately held areas which could be developed or redeveloped, but where nothing is happening currently. Both objectives will not be delivered unless the LDA focuses clearly on implementation. Although the LDA was only launched last month, we have already commenced significant work programmes to put in place the platform to achieve our goals. To make progress towards our first objective, optimising the use of state lands, the LDA, supported by the Department of An Taoiseach and the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, has begun to identify development opportunities following meetings with a number of state and semi-state bodies. From the initial trawl, the LDA has secured access to a portfolio of 8 state-owned sites, which will yield approximately 3,000 homes. Preparatory and feasibility work on these 8 sites will start imminently. But these engagements are ongoing. We're seeking to supplement the initial portfolio with additional sites and are in active discussions with various state bodies to achieve this. While state bodies must consider their own legitimate operations in identifying what land they have that can be used for housing, I have been encouraged by their constructive approach and their acceptance of the need for the public sector as a whole to help address Ireland's housing challenges. It is important to note that where another state body or agency is already advancing delivery on sites, the LDA will not seek to add complexity by becoming involved unless we can demonstrate that we can add value. In relation to the second objective, opening up large-scale strategic land banks, the agency is focused on identifying privately held lands that could be developed or repurposed for more suitable uses, including housing. It will look at near-term potential, but also growth areas for the future, especially where transport infrastructure is planned or even already in place. It is my view that some areas, even where earmarked or zoned for development, take too long for housing to be delivered on them. To remedy this situation, a structured framework to drive delivery backed by a legislative authority is needed. I'll expand on this in a moment. Combining these two strategic objectives, we can fundamentally change for the better how we approach land use in Ireland. Previously, intervention by the state was largely in the form of granting zoning and planning permission. With the creation of the LDA, we are taking a step further by playing a key role in driving the delivery of these permissions. I'd now like to turn to the initial progress the LDA has made so far, 1 month out from establishment, and the concrete work that we are doing in the short term to maximise the impact we can make over the long term. Among the key work programmes we have started are creating a comprehensive database of state lands, identifying 8 first phase sites for 3,000 homes, as I mentioned earlier, identifying ways to improve housing affordability, making the LDA fit for purpose right from the start with a best-in-class governance, corporate structure and delivery platform, and facilitating the necessary legislation to underpin the LDA's work. Taking each of these in turn, on the state lands database, first, to collectively understand what the delivery potential is from state lands, the agency needs to fully scope what land is in the state's ownership, where it's located and what its development potential is. In this respect, we've commenced work on assembling data for a complete, accurate and functional lands database. All government departments and state bodies are scheduled to provide information on lands within their control or ownership by the end of the month. The agency will then collect this information, collate it and make it publicly available. Alongside other data sources from within the state sector, the database will help us assess the delivery potential of the state's land bank. It will also highlight relocation opportunities for non-housing uses. For the first time, we'll be able to take a single view of state lands and make plans in a holistic manner rather than on a body-specific basis. Turning to the 8 sites I spoke about earlier, these are at various stages of readiness and complexity, but they share the common feature of either not being currently used for the existing operations of the landowner, or where they are being used, advanced plans are in place to relocate these operations. From a transactional perspective, the LDA has a number of options to access these sites, including acquiring the sites or acting on behalf of the landowning body to deliver the sites. The agency has already prepared its procurement documents for professional services necessary in these initial sites, including surveying, architectural and feasibility work. As a result, we can expect real work to commence on these sites in the very short term. That said, none of the sites currently have a usable planning permission in place, but that's why the LDA is here. The lead times and work necessary to make a site construction ready are well understood, but even allowing for this, we expect construction to start on the first site in 2019 and the first new homes to be delivered in 2020. Moving to improving housing affordability, generally, the LDA intends to drive this by increasing the supply of land that is available for development, providing visibility and transparency in the land market. This will help counter Ireland's boom-bust cycles in land prices, which in turn determine housing affordability. Land in some areas is priced very highly today, contributing towards the high rents we are experiencing, especially in the main urban areas. The LDA will also contribute to housing affordability in a more direct way. All of the sites in the initial portfolio, being state lands, will require the delivery of at least 40% social and affordable homes, in line with the government's policy in respect of state lands. In some cases, the level of social and affordable homes delivered from this portfolio will be even higher than 40%. Some of the landowners with a housing delivery mandate, such as the housing agency, may require higher levels of affordable housing provision on their sites that the LDA will assume control of. In relation to non-state lands, the agency may seek opportunities for providing affordable homes additional to the standard 10% social as a negotiated quid pro quo for facilitating development in certain areas. What is clear is that the LDA will be delivering a significant number of affordable homes. That is why we are working with various parties, including the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, in order to assist new housing tenures such as cost rental. The LDA can play a big role in the establishment of this form of housing provision as a permanent structural bridge of the gap between social housing and the private housing market. Turning to the LDA's governance and operations, I can tell the committee that work is underway on the recruitment of a board of directors. This will enable the LDA to put in place a governance structure to ensure transparency and oversight. The governance structure will also give effect to the LDA's initial preparatory work, as it will enable it to enter into contracts, procure services and accept funding. A draft business plan, in conjunction with other important administrative work, has been prepared for the board's consideration when it is in place. This is an essential step in getting the LDA's operational capacity up to speed. Once constituted, the LDA board will agree the LDA's recruitment needs. At this stage, we envisage building a team of 20 to 25 professionals over the next 12 months. with the experience and skills necessary to achieve the agency's objectives. Finally, it is important to state that the LDA's functions and powers will derive from legislation enacted by the Oireachtas. As I mentioned earlier, one of the LDA's strategic objectives is to assemble and open up large-scale areas for delivery, both state-owned and in private hands. A legislative framework to target these areas and help induce delivery on them in a structured manner will be critical for the LDA. We have gone some of the way towards this in the past by designating SDZs, or strategic development zones. However, as mentioned at the outset, there is now a need to extend beyond planning and into the initiation of delivery in these areas. While it is too early to say exactly what form this framework will take because it will require significant legislative support, there is real substance behind it. Intensive work is underway between the LDA, the Attorney General's Office and various government departments focused on designing the necessary measures to make sure development happens in future in a timely and structured manner. This part of the LDA's strategy is about removing blockages from the delivery system, and in this respect, and in more generally, coordination and collaboration with our partners in the local authorities will be essential. We are encouraged by successes of similar measures in other jurisdictions such as Germany and the Netherlands. In conclusion, I hope this statement provides the Committee with an overview of the LDA's objectives and the steps it is already taking towards delivering on them, 1 month into its existence. I would like to assure the Committee that my team and I are fully aware of the urgency attached to improving the supply of new housing and the importance of the LDA acting quickly, decisively and effectively in discharging any mandate given to it by the Oireachtas. We have the shared aim of delivering more homes faster and ceasing our damaging propensity towards boom and bust cycles of housing delivery. That is why I look forward to working closely with the Committee and supporting the vital role it will play in progressing the legislation needed to make the LDA a success. That concludes my opening remarks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, John. And now I'd like to call on Niall for his opening statement.
And thank you, Catherine, and members of the committee, and many thanks for the invitation to be with you here this morning. And as John has alluded to, given the high degree of importance placed by government and our department to the work of the LDA and the need to progress its legislative and operational underpinnings, there's much to be gained in shaping these through effective and practical engagement with the committee as we develop that framework. I'll come back to that later. Just 3 main areas I'd like to cover in my opening remarks. First is in relation to the policy grounding for the Land Development Agency, which goes back to the heart of the National Planning Framework and Project Ireland 2040, and indeed previous work by this committee in examining the framework at its formative stages. The details and timescales for the legislative programme being progressed by the department to put the LDA on a full primary legislative footing, and just some of the interim funding arrangements as well that have been put in place to enable it to function in the context of Budget 2018. So, as John has alluded to, just in terms of the policy basis for the LDA, I think everybody here in the room would, I suppose, agree with the broad consensus that spatial planning policies aimed at ensuring the right forms of development happen at the right time and in the right sequence, and most critically at the right locations, and all in a manner that is economic to those who require such development, whether for housing or other purposes, will not happen without a more proactive role by the state in land management terms. There's obviously been the Kenny report back to 1973, but most recently last March's National Economic Social Council report on land, and then there's the international experience in other jurisdictions that John has alluded to. So proactive management of the supply of land for development and redevelopment, for that matter, is required if strategic public policy aims are to be met in areas like sustainable urban development and housing supply. For these reasons, and to progress objectives in relation to sustainable urban development, particularly national brownfield development targets as set out in the National Planning Framework published earlier this year and the National Development Plan under Project Ireland 2040, these documents committed government to the establishment of what was then titled a National Regeneration and Development Agency. If we might go back to National Policy Objective number 66, I think in terms of the MPF, it stated that a more effective, strategic and centrally managed approach will be taken to realise the development potential of the overall portfolio of state-owned and or influenced lands in the 5 main cities, other major urban areas and in rural towns and villages as a priority, particularly through the establishment of a National Regeneration and Development Agency. The Government's establishment of the LDA on the 13th of September last is a key implementation step, therefore, in relation to the National Planning Framework's policies in this regard. The Land Development Agency will act as a key new government instrument and in line with its mandate as a centre of national expertise working with and supporting the local authorities, public bodies and other interests to harness public lands as catalysts for regeneration and wider investment, and critically to achieve compact sustainable growth, urban growth, with a particular emphasis on complex regeneration projects and the provision of social and affordable housing. As John has alluded to, the two primary objectives of the LDA are to ensure the optimal usage of state lands, coordinating their regeneration and development, and opening up key sites not being optimally used, especially for the delivery of homes. And secondly, to drive strategic land assembly through mechanisms that will bring together both public and private sector interests in ensuring the timely preparation and release of strategic land for development in a counter-cyclical manner, stabilising the tendencies towards volatility in development land values and securing more of the increase in such values as a result of the planning and infrastructure investment processes for the common good, and thereby driving increased affordability through better and more cost-competitive land availability. So just turning to the legislative programme, members, while the Land Development Agency has been initially established by way of an establishment order under the Local Government Services Corporate Bodies Act 1971 as amended, the Department recognises that the LDA requires a primary legislative footing. So to this end, primary legislation for the LDA is currently being drafted with a view to preparing a general scheme of the bill to go to Government in November. It is also envisaged that pre-legislative scrutiny with this committee would be conducted in December, and we'll be in contact with the committee shortly in relation to, I suppose, just working through some of the logistics in relation to that. Very glad for the views of the committee in that regard. And taking account of such scrutiny, as well as the complex work required in relation to the drafting of the bill, the intention is that, subject to the Government's approval, the bill will be published in the first quarter of 2019 with a view to being progressed through the Houses of the Oireachtas and enacted by the summer recess at the latest. Just in relation to funding, obviously it's very important that the Land Development Agency has funds to operate effectively in this interim and start-up phase. So on the current expenditure side, the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government has provided up to €2 million in current funding from within the Department's existing 2018 budget provisions to support the agency's initial start-up administrative and operational costs, and a further provision of €3.5 million is being provided in the context of the 2019 budget and from the Department's vote. On the capital expenditure side, an allocation of €16.5 million will be made available to the LDA from 2019 Urban and Regeneration and Development Fund on an interim basis, pending finalisation of future capitalisation of the agency that will be underpinned by primary legislation. In that regard, the Government has approved the future capitalisation of the LDA through a combination of transfers from the Irish Strategic Investment Fund in the form of subscription of share capital by the Minister of Finance and private finance up to around €1.25 billion. And capital funding will be used to fund feasibility appraisal, master planning, infrastructure provision and, if required, development of sites, as well as strategic land acquisition as may be required in the circumstances. So in conclusion, Cairlic and members, the work underway in preparing a legislative footing for the LDA is a major priority item in the Department's work and legislative programme. The Department very strongly believes that the Land Development Agency can and will make a major and strategic contribution to addressing structural gaps in Ireland's planning and development process, with a particular emphasis on proactive management of both the state development land bank and the wider functioning of the land supply process as well. So, from the Department's point of view, we look forward to further engagement with this committee in ensuring that the LDA is as effective as I think we all need it believes to be in addressing the policy issues outlined above. Thank you.
First member is Deputy O'Dowd.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I have to attend another conference later, so apologies if I have to leave fairly soon. I welcome very much our speakers today, John and Niall. I think that I very much favour and support the concept and the actions you're going to take. I think it's hugely important that there's a dynamic led organisation which gets all the state lands together and drives, and I mean really drives, the developments that are needed and where they're needed. And my key point here is that I think it's hugely important that the mix of housing is what the communities actually need. And notwithstanding the fact that you've been given a brief in the context of the portion of social affordable housing and so on, I would personally think we need to go a lot further than that. I believe we need, and I know this is probably a debate for the legislation rather than now, but I think we have to identify the acute needs that are there right now. And that's obviously homelessness, affordable housing, social housing. I think I'm unclear as to whether you have a brief in relation to cooperative housing. I think that would be hugely important as well. But the key to it all is proper planning. If you take the city of Dublin, young people are being driven from our city because they can't afford the rents. Even people with very good jobs can't live in the city. So what is the future for a young family with 2 or 3 children looking to start up? Where is the affordable housing for them? How are our cities going to change? Is it going to be a city where only those who have extremely well paid live? And is it going to be places where you don't have a dynamic social mix? And that's what I mean by communities of all ages and all types and all mixes living together. And I think the planning of what you do has to be hugely important. So it's not just assembling the site. Where is that site? What are the needs in that area? What is the present demographic pressure? How many families with young children are living there? How many older people are living there? How many homeless people are there? That we have an integrated, balanced, proper, dynamic focus in this agency. I think it is a huge opportunity for us to get it right, but it also we can get it very, very wrong. And so I welcome the funding that Niall talks about there. I think it's hugely important that you will have the money to go ahead, but I am really concerned about that, and I believe the interaction of the agency with the likes of McVerry Trust, of Threshold, with all of those is hugely important, and how they all network in through the local authorities as well to get the outcome we all want. So I think, those are my concerns. I think we have to make sure that Dublin in particular and other places develop as proper, integrated, dynamic, modern cities with the needs of all the people met there. That's what I'm worried about. If we're going to give 60% of this land bank to developers to develop whatever they wish, and we keep 40%, I don't think developers should decide what type of housing goes into a site. I think obviously we need developers, we need them, we need to work with them. I favour obviously working with the private sector, but we have to have it right. And because it's state funds and because it's money given by the taxpayer to the local authorities or the state body initially, we have to make sure that the outcomes are right for the people who need the housing. And I'm just very concerned about it, that we get it right. And I welcome, as I said, and I'm not being critical at all. One of the key issues is going to be transparency of your decision making, transparency of your interaction, transparency of the funding that's going to be set up on sites. And the last thing we want is a scandal about state lands costing millions being sold for thousands for fellas to make quick bucks. Let's be honest, that's the worry people have there. So I think the transparency of what you do. Now, one of the issues about the agencies, I understand that it's been set up as a commercial state agency, which means it is not, repeat, it is not accountable in the context of the expenditure of its funds to the Oireachtas. It will not be audited by the Auditor General. And I think it's hugely important that we get this right as well. I don't doubt the integrity of everybody concerned, but I must have, and I will insist on my vote, on accountability and transparency and value for money. And the problem is, if these agencies or these deals that are done, if they're commercial, then they're not subject to freedom of information. And I understand that's an issue that applies right across the board on commercial issues, but I think we have to get it right. And I believe there has to be accountability. Now, how you define that accountability is a matter for the legislation. But I think, would we be satisfied with an independent audit if the funding being spent exceeds, say, 1 million or whatever the figure is? How do you work that accountability in so that people have confidence in everything that you're doing? And I want to say that I absolutely support the private sector. I absolutely say we need them, but we need to manage it, and we need to make sure as well, and the other point I want to make is, having been involved in the creation of a wonderful body called Irish Water, one of the first things Irish Water did was to disappear off the radar. I have to remind myself to make sure that I lived through this awful period of life. and still survived to sit in this Oireachtas as elected representative, because I stood up for what I believed in, what was true and what didn't happen. And Niall will know that because he works in the department, he knows what I think. But I want to make sure that this agency doesn't fall into the same trap. And the trap is consultants. The trap is once you're set up, you disappear and there's no accountability, and you come before the Oireachtas once a year. And maybe if you're dragged in by Sinn Féin and the Workers' Party or myself, you might come in. Or people for profit, sorry. I always thought you were a worker. But we have to have that. We have to have. We have to get this right. It's the biggest scandal facing our society. Now is the right time to set it up. And I feel very strongly about this. And I feel that the accountability, freedom of information, whatever you can get out of that, statutory reporting to the Oireachtas, through the Oireachtas Committee, I would like to see it quarterly, certainly. And that we will keep our eyes on you and what you are doing. Because we know, and I believe that what you want to do is what we want you to do, which is to build the right type of housing, the correct mix. And I suppose at the end of the day, if you look at Dublin, and it's where a huge pressure is on at the moment, but if you look at Dublin in 20 years' time, that families will live in affordable housing in all areas, There is no area that there shouldn't be social housing in, there shouldn't be affordable housing in, there shouldn't be cooperative housing in, and we can't allow the city to develop. Those who have money own everything, and those who want to work, live and rear their families have to live outside the city, have long commutes and have very poor quality of life. And I think that's it really. So thank you, Chairperson, for indulging me this morning.
Go to you first, John.
Thanks, Deputy. The very interesting remarks that resonate with us, certainly as we've been going through this process and the setup of the LDA. And just to touch on a couple of points that you made in relation to the appropriate tenure mix, and make sure that it's not just blanket, that it's right for the area, that we put the right housing in the right locations for the people that require it in those areas. And in that respect, we're very tightly aligned with, obviously, planning policy driving the decision-making process, and we'll be very close to the local authorities in working out what the appropriate tenure mix is for each site, to make sure that we're delivering the right kind of housing in those locations. You made the other point as well, that we need to make sure that in our methodologies that we don't allow, parts of state sites to go off to developers, and that they're lost, then they can be flipped or something like that. I'll just make a couple of observations in relation to that. We share that concern as well, and one of the ways that we're going to deal with that is the transactional methods that we're going to deploy when we're dealing with the sites that are in our remit. And I guess, around the time of the launch of the LDA, there was a bit of a narrative that, we were going to be just releasing sites out to developers and they can do whatever they want to them. And that is actually not true at all. Just to outline what we intend to do with our strategy in that respect is, firstly, we're all about enabling developable sites. So not just to release any old site onto the market, no matter what stage it's at. It's to make sure it's developable, but also to make sure that it will be developed. So what our intention is to do a lot of the activities that developers would traditionally have done themselves. So that would be where value is created in the process, say through land assembly, through achieving the right zoning, through achieving the right planning, achieving the right tenure mix, and then looking to see what our options are in relation to delivery. So we're going to go quite a bit down the way in terms of determining what's going to be on that site. And the second point I'd like to make in that respect is how that site is released, or how a partner is brought in, if it's decided that the LDA doesn't take on the development itself, which is also possible. And we can cover off on making sure that delivery happens on that site by being clever about how we transact. That could include licensing, it could include remaining involved in a JV, which would all give the LDA some say in how that site is delivered and when it's delivered, not just released to the developer to do whatever he wants with. So we've been very clear on that. On the accountability and the transparency side of things, we will be subject to the code of practice for the governments and state bodies, and we see that as the whole accountability area as a critical part of the LDA setup. And so that's why we're going to have a board, we're going to have all the oversight in terms of committees, audit and risk and so on, to make sure that we're doing the right things. But as well, I agree, regular interaction with the Oireachtas committees is also very important. We'll be more than happy to very constructively and enthusiastically engage with the various committees to ensure that it is seen that the correct oversight is on the LDA. So hopefully that touches on a few of your points, deputies.
We just let Niall in then, Fergus, and then I'll let you back in.
Thank you. Yeah.
Niall.
Very little to add to that, apart from saying, I suppose, that the Deputy has put his finger on it in terms of, I suppose, that the broader planning context or policy remit that the LDA is designed to fit into. You know, we are seeing, again, you know, patterns whereby people are struggling to maybe obtain the houses that they need at the rent or the purchase price points that they need closer to where they're working, and you're getting a displacement effect of that to more outlying locations. So, you know, and I suppose we have to be, and I think the National Planning Framework is very clear in relation to the vision for our major urban areas out into the future, that we could have the living and the working and all of the different, I suppose, opportunities that should be there in our cities and that. So just to acknowledge that really is at the core of what the LDA is about.
60 seconds. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate you. You've been very helpful in terms of time. I accept that that's what you might want to do in the context, John, of the state bodies, but that doesn't go far enough at all for me. At this moment in time, I'm fighting with a state body to get audit reports from them, which is an absolute sick joke. They give me blacked out pages of findings of internal audits, which is entirely unacceptable. And the fact that I'm seeking them as chairman of Oireachtas committee, which I have to bring to the attention of my committee, is a disgrace as well. I mean, that's what we cannot have. And I know that's not what you want. So notwithstanding everything you say, you didn't mention, and I want to have a friendly tone, not a hostile one. The freedom of information is hugely important in terms of accountability. And you will have to find, in my view, a way of working the freedom of information, excluding the commercial sensitivities, but with independent, absolute independent audit, so that we can get at the nub of the issue, because that is where it's at. And I obviously don't doubt your intentions in that matter, but I would just be, I think we need to put a bit more thought, not that you're not putting a lot of thought, we need to put deeper thought into what you're doing. And are there other agencies internationally which are taking on this role? Maybe we can learn from those. I don't know the answer to that question. But the key point is that, notwithstanding all the buzzwords of, you know, of making sure that the council and everybody else is lining up, I think you need to have a master plan in place before you go into any site. You must have the master plan. It must be in black and white. It must be based on the demographic of that area, or it may be based on the future needs of the demographic of that area. Issues like, because you will have huge sites and huge resources, you know, employment, where they're going to work, how are they going to travel, schools, education, recreation, amenity, where older people will live. You know, these are the contexts of your huge decisions that you have to make. And again, I'll finish. I very much support what you're doing. You need to put a lot more thought into it. And the one question I don't know if it has to, I'm sure somebody else will. These damn consultants, you know, the first thing Irish Water did was they disappeared out of my office, and I probably never saw them again for months. But they're sending these people into me to give me a lot of, I won't say what I would call it, but the facts were in the background. Consultants were being hired, money was being spent, nobody was accountable, nobody knew what was going on, and we ended up in an awful, absolute appalling mess. Now, I've no doubt that you don't want to do that, but I know that people have to speak here, but can you, in your replies, just how will you make sure that that doesn't happen? What can you tell me today that you will not use consultants? That, you know, not that you won't use them, but that there will be transparency about when you use them, and their accountability and your accountability. The other thing that happened, and I know just because it just struck me as an important point, when Irish Water was set up, it was supposed to be an independent entity. The first thing it did was it linked up all their pay and their pensions with another state organisation. And straight away, what was intended never to happen, an agency became a place where people got paid, I believe, that was never intended that they should. And, what your salary is going to be, all those things. We need to know all of that. We need to have all of that in the space of public realm and knowledge, so that we will all support and agree and back and fight for and make sure that your agency succeeds. And that's the only way it will work. Thank you.
A lot of that we're going to tease through a pre-legislative scrutiny as well, John, but I'm going to go to Deputy O'Brien, and you might just allude to some of those comments then. Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, John. And apologies for being late, but I had read the presentations before I came in. Look, let me make a general comment and then just have a series of very specific questions to tease out the detail. As both of you know, I'm strongly in favour of a strategic land management agency. I think the idea of having a central body that looks at the totality of public land holdings and has the power and has the funds to take them away from agencies where they're not strategically utilised to the best extent and transferred elsewhere is the right thing to do. And I've no issue with that whatsoever. And if that was all you were in here to tell us about, I'd be warmly welcoming it and indicating that we'd be assisting you with the legislation. My problem is twofold. The first is that you'll be involved in residential development, and you've yet to make the case as to why you were better placed to do that than local authorities if they were properly funded and if they had various restrictions lifted from them, which I'll come to in a second. And I also have to say the tenure mix that you've proposed is not in line either with local requirements or with housing needs. And in fact, my concern is, and I have detailed direct involvement in one large joint venture, and I've been keeping a very close track on the other two. So my comments in relation to your financing models and your tenure mix isn't born out of some speculation. It's 2 years of experience tracking these in my own local authority area in Dublin City, and that's really where my strong concern is. My questions are as follows. The first is and I'd be interested in responses from both of you. Can you tell us what additional powers you are hoping to get in the legislation? Is it just the standard compulsory purchase order powers that local authorities already have, or are you looking for something in addition to that? And if so, can you detail that and explain how it's different to the powers that councils currently have? In terms of the Strategic Investment Fund financing, it would be fair to say, would it not, that the majority of that is probably going to go into land acquisition and compensating CPO claims, or do you have a sense of the breakdown in terms of site development, your own direct involvement in the delivery of units, as opposed to private sector finance for that and land acquisition? In terms of units then, can you confirm that where there are social units, there will be additional money from the capital programme, for example, of the Department of Housing to purchase those back, as would be the case in the other joint ventures that are currently underway, so that in fact the cost of the social units isn't included in your own costings? That would be additional Department of Housing funding. And likewise, can you clarify in terms of affordable units, will you be seeking, or is there discussions about seeking access to, for example, the Service Sites Fund, or, for example, will the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan Facility be one of the primary mechanisms of making those units affordable? Because none of your presentations actually, they give us the price range, but they don't tell us how people are going to access those. In terms of the sale, and look, I'm very clear, there is no land giveaway here. Land will be sold, if it is to be sold, to developers as part of joint ventures. But will it be sold at market rates? Will there be a discount as a result of, for example, the site servicing costs, and therefore could it be that the developer is getting the land cheaper? And for the 60% of units in your overall target that will be at open market price, is there not then a discount, even though they're paying market value? That market value might be less because the sites are serviced. And can you confirm that all of the profit from the sale of open market price units, if there are private developers in the context of a joint venture, all of the profits will go to the private developer? On the social housing targets, and for me this is the really incorrect bit of what you're doing. The first thing is, every time I see a reference to Part 5 in your literature, I want to pull my hair out. Part 5 applies to private land and private developments. It does not apply, and it is not a planning framework for public land. Now, I am in favour of mixed income and mixed tenure estates, although I have a slightly different model to the government's. But there is no justification, or I'd like to hear your justification for the 10% figure. What it actually means is, on very large sites, we will dramatically reduce the capacity of the state to deliver social housing. And I suspect the reason why you're reducing the social housing component to 10%, currently it's 30% in the joint ventures in Dublin City and South Dublin County Council, is actually much more to do with the fact that you want to use joint ventures to keep this off balance sheet to meet EU financing rules. And therefore, the tenure mix is not about meeting need. The tenure mix is about meeting a pre-prescribed set of financing commitments, which are actually going to limit your ability to meet social housing need. Also, can you confirm with your social and affordable units, they are not in addition to National Development Plan and Rebuilding Ireland targets, they are just within those targets, and therefore there's no additionality. And then finally, a couple of small questions, Chair. One of the things that concerns me is people say local authorities can't do this and that's why we need a new agency. But one of the advantages you'll have that local authorities don't have is you won't have to comply, unless I'm incorrect, with the very complex approval and tendering requirements of the Department of Housing, or, for example, the very cumbersome value for money exercise that local authorities have to currently comply with for projects over 20 million, which we'll hear about later. So I would have thought if local authorities were given those advantages and additional CPO powers, they could do everything that you could do, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that. I also have to say I have a huge concern. I sat through and was very involved in the Kilcarbery joint venture. One of the frustrations for elected members in the community is because of the competitive nature of the bringing in of the private consortium, was that actually elected members in the community had less involvement in the planning outline. The managers did, and you're absolutely correct, the managers are very involved in the planning, the scheme outline. But in fact, because it's a competitive process, it's secret, and elected members of the community know the outcome of that at the end, and that's a concern. Existing sites that you have, are any of them local authority? Are you intending to try and acquire local authority sites, and if so, why? And then the last thing, look, there is a dogma we hear a lot around sustainable and mixed tenure communities. And again, I am in favour of mixed income and mixed tenure communities. But can either of you point to a single piece of research that has been produced in an Irish context that supports sustainable and mixed tenure communities on the basis that you're outlining, with a 10% only social housing component? The reason why I'm asking that is because, in fact, there's a growing body of research that says if you have only 10% social housing, that actually increases the sense of isolation of lower income families and communities. So I'm just wondering, what's the policy basis or evidence for your commitment to that?
Thanks, Eoin. Niall, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, perhaps. There's a lot of questions there, so I'll do my best to try and address them. But I suppose, Coherric and members, we are at the very early stages of the drafting of legislative programmes, so I think a lot of the function today is to listen, to take on board the points that have been made, and to take that back into the legislative process. So, as you can probably appreciate, I suppose some of the policy deliberations around the sort of main legislative parameters of legislation haven't been finalised. So it's very important, obviously, we have this sort of engagement to, I suppose, hear what the members of the committee feel are important issues for us to address. But just I'll try to, and John will come in, I think, on other points. Just in relation to additional powers that the agency would have over and above the as-is situation in terms of local authorities. We are examining that at the moment, and certainly, I suppose, the effectiveness of the compulsory purchase process is something I think we need to look at very carefully. As the Deputy probably is aware, the Law Reform Commission has a piece of work ongoing around looking at CPO legislation more generally, and it's very important that we harvest, if you like, the insights from that and see what we can deal with in the context of the LDA bill. I think it's also fair to say that in terms of powers and that, a very important function of the Land Development Agency, and maybe it's not getting enough priority or focus, is the job of building up a baseline understanding of who owns what in relation to the public sector. There isn't a composite view, as the Deputy knows, of that at the moment, and it's a very, very important baseline piece so that there is a proper land management policy sort of approach. And also, I suppose, that something that flows from that is the ability of a land development agency to, if you like, put the microscope over, composite ownerships and whether there is some sort of, I suppose, strategic approach that maybe should be used to further the development of it, and to ask that question in relation to whether the lands, even though they may have a very perfectly valid operational function, whether that's the appropriate use of the lands, bearing in mind wider policy parameters that the Deputy would be well familiar with. And I suppose how that interacts with the planning process in relation to absolutely respecting that the members of the local authority are, the ones who decide on development plans and policies and so on and so forth. But I suppose activating that conversation in relation to whether, the configuration in a current development plan or, how zonings and all of that are working is the most optimal, bearing in mind that there are significant, I suppose, strategic land assembly options available. I'll let John maybe come in on the ISIF, and that would, again, I suppose, the commitment by the Minister for Public Expenditure Reform and Finance and our own Minister in relation to the funding of the LDA is, I suppose, a visible commitment that, we're not setting up a body here that is not in funds, that does not have resources to deploy in the context of its work. But we are at a very early stage in relation to a breakdown of how that would actually be deployed, and I suppose that goes back to the business plan. John will maybe speak about that. In relation to the units being delivered, the social and affordable units, and will there be additional money for the purchase of these? I think we just have to step back a little bit and remember that through the work of the LDA, particularly in relation to, I suppose, getting access to lands that hitherto have been in the ownership of state bodies who have other priorities and so on, it's really opening up a new tranche of land that probably is in the local authority development plan or zoning and so on, but there's nothing happening on it. And I suppose the work of the land agency will be in relation to marrying up the making available of that land and the existing capital programmes and current programmes that are there for social and affordable housing delivery. So it's not a question of there's additional money needed. This is about ensuring that the money that has been reserved is actually deployed and can be spent and put to good work in relation to the government and the interest of the taxpayer, etc., etc. And you made a very good point, Deputy, in relation to the Serviced Site Fund, the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan. You're absolutely correct. These are all mechanisms, I think, that can be deployed in the context of the work of the Land Development Agency in relation to that. I'll let John come in on the market rates and the land and the transactional pieces around that. And also maybe, and he probably will touch upon, as I think we have stated very clearly, whereas obviously there's a minimum requirement of 10% social housing provision in the context of the provisions of Part 5, that will not be a barrier on the Land Development Agency implementing the mandate given to it in terms of broader government policy, but also in relation to the requirements of particular public landowners of sites that would be in effect going to the LDA in relation to advancing for development. And a good example of that would be the housing agency lands, where in effect the vast bulk, if not all, of those lands would be developed for social and affordable purposes. So it's kind of wrong to say that there's some sort of, I suppose, policy limit in terms of, I suppose, the level of social housing that would be provided on all the LDA sites. It very much varies on the circumstances, the provenance of those sites in terms of, I suppose, what they were purchased for in the first place and so on and so forth. And just, I suppose, related to the question about, will additional funds be required to sort of pay for the social units and so on coming forward? Obviously, the work of the LDA is being targeted at, making, I suppose, additional progress in relation to the delivery of the housing targets set out in Rebuilding Ireland, the 35,000 plus units that we require. We know we're short in relation to the delivery of that, right across the full continuum of housing solutions that we require. Obviously, the LDA will be an important delivery piece in relation to the achievement of those targets, including the provision of additional social housing solutions and that off lands that currently are off limits in the context of the work of the local authorities and the cooperative housing bodies, indeed, that Deputy O'Dowd mentioned. And I think maybe I'll just leave it at that. Sorry, John.
Thanks, Niall. John?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Deputy, for the questions. I'll do my best to touch on some of the points that Niall prompted me on there as well. Hopefully we're dealing comprehensively with your queries. Just in respect of the use of funds query and what are we going to be using that money for, and it's a very important question. I think it's very important that the LDA will be capitalised to be able to, but ultimately we're trying to make an impact on the land market and to make land available for supply. From time to time that will involve certain actions which are capital intensive, which could be, as you pointed out, in relation to a CPO, if we need to do that as a last resort, I guess. Overall, where we're looking to prioritise deployment of capital in our business plan will be in where we're getting maximum bang for buck in making land open and available for delivery. And that's not just by buying land or doing anything like that. It's improving it, it's servicing it, it's getting the planning, getting the right planning policy in place on that land. So that's ultimately where we're trying to get to. So we may need to spend money on CPO, as I mentioned. We may, in a counter-cyclical way, buy some land to build up some land that could be made open and made available. My view is that in a lot of locations, land is very highly valued at the moment. I don't think it would be particularly good use of state funds to be getting into the land market in a big way right now. Yeah. And we don't want to throw fuel on the fire of an already hot land market, because my view is that high land prices are really at the core of our problem at the moment. Like if you look at it, if we're agreed that restrictions or delays in bringing forward land causes a lack of it to be available, that causes high land values, that causes feeds into high housing costs, high rents, and our role is to take the pressure out of that system. So that's where we're looking to get maximum bang for our buck in terms of the funding that's been given. So how do we do that? How do we bring forward land? It could be by acquisition, as I mentioned, or CPO. It could be by providing infrastructure that can cause blockages for years and years, as you'll know, in respect to some sites, even in respect of SDZs, and to do that in a way that it's recouped and that value is had for the state in terms of its money that it spends in that respect. And in time, if land is available at reasonable prices in a very strategic way, say unzoned currently, though that may be zoned into the future around future infrastructure provision, Metrolink and the like, those are things that we look at as well. But we're looking for maximum impact, and we're going to be very judicious in the deployment of it. In terms of the value extraction from dealing with perhaps the private sector, be they developers or contracting firms or whatever, our approach has always been to go up the development curve. So if you look at a developer, what does a developer do? It doesn't just build houses on land. The development process and the value add and the value creation and the profit in development starts with the site, with no planning, no zoning, and the assembly of that site, to bringing it through the zoning process, bringing it through planning, servicing. That's where the money is made in development, and that's what the LDA is going to try and do for two reasons. Firstly, to extract value for the state out of the money that's spent on that land, and then secondly, to make sure that it is actually brought forward and done in a structured way and brought forward for development so that it can be delivered and isn't stymied by things like infrastructure and servicing. And in terms of how we deal with developers, it's going to be in a commercial way. We will look to bring in covenants to make sure that the land is delivered. So that could be through delivery commitments that are time-bound. It could be through licensing, where we can intervene and step in if the particular site isn't being delivered for whatever reason, so that the state always, through the LDA, has some sort of control in the tempo of delivery on that site, which I think is very important, because we don't want to lose the control of what's delivered on it. We're going to try and extract the best deal possible, and I think one of the ways to do that might be to stay in for some of the upside along the way, which is financially hopefully beneficial for the state, but also secondly should be able to help ensure delivery. One of the other points you alluded to was, well, couldn't the local authorities be given similar powers or abilities to the LDA? Couldn't they just do this? And I guess when you look at what we intend to deal with, we're looking across state bodies, but we're not just looking at state bodies which are additional to obviously just local authorities. If you look at our initial portfolio, it's mostly non-local authority land, and our big opportunity that we see is across the state sector, but also into the private sector as well. So I think we're going to go further than just local authority owned land, and we, as I say, we may involve private land. But as well as that, I think it's important, given the problem and given that land availability is at the core of the problem that we have at the moment, that we have an agency with the sole focus on making land available and making sure that supply land is there. And that's all we do. That's our dedicated focus. So I think that's very important. But I think it's also important to note that in terms of any interactions that we have with local authorities, we're not seeking to add complexity. We're not seeking to get in the way of what they're doing, and there's a lot of good work being done by the local authorities. We're not seeking to upset that. It's only where we can provide additionality that we're looking to get involved. And a good example of that actually is in relation to the Dyke Road site in Galway, where we've gone to the local authority in Galway and said that, look, is there anything we can do to assist? Is there any additionality we can bring? And in that particular situation, there was a shortage of resources within the council on the executive basis to work through a site like that, through the planning process to delivery. So we've been asked to step in on a service provision basis in that situation, but only because we're providing additionality. We're not getting in the way. That's not what we're seeking to do. So I hope that touches on some of your points. Happy to develop them if you wish.
60 seconds on.
Supplementary. There's a bunch of my questions which weren't answered, but I'll come back to those in PQs. The 10% social housing target is your target now. It's in the launch document. The 30% affordable housing is in the launch document, and it's in both of the presentations today. And it's all very well saying, oh, well, there may be some sites, for example, housing agency, that might have more. But the model that you have put forward is not only based on a very controversial model, the joint venture, but it's a poorer deal in terms of meeting social and affordable housing needs. So I suppose I'm going to repeat the question, which is the 10 and the 30, those targets, are they not based on what you think is a commercially viable financing model to attract the private sector and keep it off balance sheet, rather than meeting housing need? And John, the problem with your response to the question I had around the residential end of it, because I don't dispute what you're saying about the strategic land management, is we've two choices here. We've Shangana, which is a brilliant idea, which is 100% essentially public housing, mixing social, affordable rental and affordable purchase on a public site, which will meet the needs of that local area, versus your model, which is an even worse version of Kilcarbery that we've just been through in South Dublin, which is only a percentage of the land to meet social and or affordable housing need, and the rest meeting private sector open market price need. That is not a strategic use of public land. So your added value, in my view, should be acquiring all those state lands from other public bodies and then joint venturing with local authorities to deliver Shangana Castle or to deliver the kinds of developments many of us have been arguing for in our own local authorities, which is fully public, mixed income, mixed tenure estates, where you don't need private developers. Sure, you'd use private builders, as local authorities do, and you'll do in a way that will maximise the output of social and affordable housing. So I've yet to hear either of you explain why that joint venture model and the 10% social and 30% affordable, it makes any sense whatsoever. It does add complications and reduces the state's ability to meet its social and affordable housing targets.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Glad to come back and try and answer all the questions that have been addressed. But just to categorically say that the 10-30%, I suppose, framework in the context of the state lands affordability, social housing requirement or obligation of state lands, it's not based on any, if you like, economic or balance sheet dogma. From an attempt to keep this as an off-balance sheet. I mean, we have very deliberately, Deputy, intend the Land Development Agency to stand on its own feet commercially outside of the general government sector, and that gives it a lot of flexibility in relation to how it's capitalised and how it can function in the broader land market. But the 10-30% is not being done in a way to sort of enable that. And just let me
the logic of it.
Let me finish. I mean, as I suppose is laid out in, I suppose, Rebuilding Ireland, government policy and so on around housing and so on, we need a whole range of housing solutions across the full continuum of the housing sector. Whether you're a student, absolutely. And if
takes responsibility to provide public land for 350,000
We let Niall respond. He didn't interfere. He didn't interrupt you. We let him respond. Okay, you'll have time to come back in. We'll let him respond, but at least give him the courtesy of answering the question you asked.
Apologies, Chair.
That's all right, Deputy. I mean, the state's obligations are absolutely in relation to social and affordable housing. They're also ensuring effective housing supply in relation to all sectors of society. There are people out there who need social housing. There are people who need assistance in relation to ensuring that the housing that they may are struggling to provide themselves are affordable to them. There are lots of people out there who are looking for homes to buy, looking for homes to rent, and have, if you like, the economic conditions and so on to do that, and that's good for them. We have to provide housing for all sectors of society, and that is a fundamental tenet of government policy, not to, in effect, lock up public lands only for one segment of society. And that's very, very important in the context of ensuring that there is a braided solution to meeting the complex housing requirements right across society. So the 10 or 30% division is not coming from, as I said, some sort of economic or balance sheet perspective. It's very much, I suppose, coming from the context of securing the balance, the mixed tenure communities and so on and so forth. But it is very much, I suppose, a baseline, objective. And I think, as will be seen in relation to the work of the LDA, we will see, and you mentioned one particular initiative on one local authority area, I think we will see many of those projects advance in the context of the work of the LDA, using the housing agency lands particularly, but not necessarily restricted to that alone. So it would be wrong to say that, that you're only ever going to see 10% social and 30% affordable in relation to developments on public lands. But we need to provide housing for all.
John, do you want to qualify anything there?
No, nothing much to add, Chair, other than to say that the 30% additional to the affordable in respect to the 10% social is very significant. Like, if you think about it and you look at the Dundrum site that we're looking at, which will hopefully yield about 1,500 homes, versus if that was left up to the private sector and just sold, maybe 150 social units alone will come from that. But through the LDA's intervention, there'll be 600 social and affordable units provided on that, including perhaps the basis of a new housing tenure cost rental that we're looking to develop as well. So I think there's a lot of positivity, but as well as that, it's additive, it's accretive, it's development and delivery that wouldn't have otherwise happened had we not intervened. So overall, I think it's very positive. I know what the Deputy is saying, and I can understand why he's saying it, but in terms of the impact that we can have, I think it's much greater if we take a balanced view across all segments.
Mick?
So, Niall made an interesting point there, that we don't want to lock up public lands only for one segment of society. I would put it to you that is what is happening at the moment. Let's look at the 60-30-10 mix. Average price, market price, private development, Dublin today, €378,000. Right? So what is proposed here is that 60% of public lands would be used to facilitate private development with prices in that ballpark, varying from city to city. 30% affordable. Now, there's ambiguity about the affordability scheme that was indicated by the Minister in the budget speech. We're hoping to get a bit more detail on that quite soon. But if you do the math in what the Minister indicated in the budget statement, you're looking at an average of 50 grand off market price for affordable. So 378 minus 50, certainly in the capital, you're looking at affordable houses being part of a scheme with the potential to be above the €300,000 mark. And the segments of society who can't afford that, which don't just include young people coming out of college, but include workers on the average wage, are effectively being locked out of the housing market. There's a phrase that I'm beginning to hear more and more often now, and that's the phrase, the locked-out generation. 500,000 young people, according to the Central Statistics Office from the last census, living at home with their parents. Sure, some of them want to be there. I suspect large numbers would far prefer to be buying, to be renting, to be living independently. So we don't want to lock up public lands only for one segment of society. That's precisely what's happening at the moment. The people who have big money or the people who are affluent. And the others, which is the majority, are being locked out. Now here's a tremendous opportunity to turn that on its head, to reverse it. You know, the amount of public lands in this state, even the ones already zoned residential, the housing analyst Mel Reynolds has indicated there's enough between the local authorities and NAMA to build 114,000 public houses. I mean, you'd put one hell of a dent in the housing crisis if we said public housing, public lands, by which I mean a mix of council housing and a mix of genuinely affordable housing. Housing which is not done through developers but through the state hiring builders and then selling at cost price, thereabouts. It's a tremendous opportunity there. And the concern is that the Land Development Agency's remit is pointing in an opposite direction. And that what we're looking at here is not something like the ESB or Aer Lingus, as the Taoiseach said, a state company that did the state some service, but a new agency which oversees privatisation of land on a large scale for houses mainly built at market rates, therefore unaffordable, or houses built according to the government's affordable housing scheme, which are also unaffordable for many. Maintaining and copper fastening a position where big numbers are locked out of the housing market. So my question is this. The Land Development Agency is going to assemble lands. Those lands are lands that are currently in state ownership, Health Service, ESB, Bord Gosh, etc. But also acquire some lands from the private sector. But what's the mix likely to be? Is it overwhelmingly lands that are currently in state ownership? That seems to be the case, but you can perhaps clarify on that. And then to release said lands in a skillful way for housing development. But what kind of housing development? Is it the case that the majority of it seems to be, will be, deals with developers for 60, 30, 10, mainly private market housing developments, or will there be a significant level, and if so, what level, of arrangements with local authorities, whereby local authorities get a say in relation to those lands and can use the lands for social and genuinely affordable housing? Because unless that is the overwhelming thrust of this, what you're looking at is privatisation on a big scale, and what you're looking at is a continuation of the majority being locked out of the housing market. So those are my questions.
Thanks, Mick. John, do you want to come in first?
Thanks, Deputy, for the questions, and appreciate the points made. I guess when we're looking at how the LDA can improve affordability, I think you have to look at the bigger picture with the LDA, the overarching reason for its setup. It's not, even though it will deliver in the short term, it's not been set up just to deliver in the short term on specific sites, and the tenure of those sites that you've touched on, I'll speak about in a minute. But the bigger picture here is to look at the reason why we have a lack of affordability in this country. What's the core base reason? What's underlying it all? The symptoms are a lack of affordability. What's the core reason? And we think that one of those major core reasons is the lack of deliverable development land being made available to the market. And that's not just from the state, that's from private lands as well. And that, as a result of that, when you think about it, back in 2008, land was effectively frozen up for 6, 7, 8 years from the crash. It was tied up in creditor processes and other reasons that tied up the availability of the land. And nothing was done with that land for long periods of time, no planning work, no advancing of the land in terms of infrastructure, etc., because the money wasn't available or it was tied up in some shape or form. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we have an affordability problem in this country now after land was pretty much locked up from all sectors for 6 or 7 years. I don't think that's coincidental. So if you believe that, and if you believe that that is a core issue in relation to the problem that we have today, then that follows that restrictions or delays in bringing forward land for delivery cause high land values. And I think it's undeniable that high land values then cause an increase in the cost of delivering a home. And I think that's irrefutable, or rent that's been charged in relation to housing that's built for rental. And the LDA's core objective is to tackle that core issue and make much more land available for delivery so that we don't have these boom, bust, very high or nil values for land that we've experienced over the past 10 years, which is really the core of our issue. So we've a big structural involvement that we're going to play in respect to the market. And it's not just what we deliver today or tomorrow and the 10-year mix there. It's going to the core of why are we suffering from this issue. Because ultimately high land costs fall at the feet of the person buying or renting. That's the core of the issue that we seek to address. That's really the big picture for the LDA, and I can't stress that enough. On the privatisation piece, some obviously private homes will be built, but that privatisation, that has the effect of normal people that are buying up houses on the open market as a result of them being developed. So these are going to homeowners, so the land effectively transfers through the development process to homeowners. So the privatisation piece is not necessarily to, say, a faceless corporate or something like that. It will, in many cases, be to people that want to own and buy their own house, and I think that's a legitimate form of supply as well. So hopefully that touches on some of your points, Deputy.
Thank you, Gerlach, and thank you, Deputy, for the questions. I mean, it's very important that we have this engagement to hear the views of the committee, and I suppose as I said, I want to go back to that point all the time. We don't have a detailed piece of legislation before us, but it's very important that we hear the views of the committee and we take that back in the context of, I suppose, refining the legislation. But just, I suppose, just to answer your two specific questions, you know, it is fair to say that the LDA, in relation to land assembly, I suppose, focus will be particularly around the public sector lands in the initial phases, absolutely. In relation to, I suppose, working with local authorities, and particularly, I suppose, in terms of social and affordable housing delivery, you know, from a departmental point of view, and we are a department of, you know, housing planning and local government, we will be very, very keen to see how we can go further, how we can, you know, ensure that the activities of the LDA enhance the opportunities that local authorities will want to see in their own local authority development plans, own housing strategies and so on, for the delivery of housing generally in their functional areas, and also social and affordable housing purposes as well. So, and I think it's very important that, you know, as I mentioned in my response to Deputy O'Brien earlier, that we use new funding instruments like the Service Side Fund and the Rebuilding Ireland home loans and so on and so forth, in combination with the social housing delivery functions of the local authorities and other housing providers in the social housing space, like the housing associations that Deputy O'Dowd mentioned earlier, in the context of realising the potential of sites. So I suppose as I've said earlier, we have a baseline, I suppose, objective, but I suppose very much the ambition to go beyond that, where and however that is possible.
Mick, do you want 60 seconds?
No further questions.
Oh, thanks. Richard?
I don't know where to begin, really, with all this, because there's so many questions. Can I just ask a couple of just quick ones to just get a few little facts? How many staff have you got?
We've just been conceived, Deputy, so we have a staff at 3 at the moment. Our board is in the process of being appointed. When we have a board, they will approve our recruitment plan, which we have in place. So that recruitment plan indicates that we plan to get up to around 20 to 25 staff over the next 12 months.
25 staff. And the board will be, what, a voluntary board or paid board? Or?
It's intended that the LDA is operating as a commercial state body, so I would imagine the board will be a paid board.
A paid board. Did you know how many people will be on it?
A maximum of 10.
10 on the board. And who will decide what they're paid?
I believe that will be up to the Minister and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform.
It's within guidelines.
So it should be within guidelines for comparable agencies.
Okay, and do you know what the timeline is to get up to your full staff complement? And all
Full complement. Yeah, I think you know, when you look at it, if we were to hire someone today, typically they'll be employed by someone else. They'll have a notice period. So I would have thought 12 months would be a reasonable time frame for that to happen.
12 months.
But what I would say, Deputy, is that notwithstanding that lead-in time, real work is underway already in respect to the sites. We're not wasting any time in bringing on the sites that we have access to. It's not that we have to wait till we have a staff of 25 and 12 months. We're working now on these positions.
Okay, but 12 months before you're up to full capacity, as it were. Can you name the sites? 8 you mentioned. Can you name them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they have been.
Deputy Boy Barrett's not a member of the
Not
committee.
a member of the committee.
Okay, yeah, sure.
It'll be on our website.
Yeah, I'll take you through. The first site is in Dundrum. It's the current Central Mental Hospital. So that's probably the largest site that we have. Should be large-scale delivery available on that one. We have a site in Skerries. We have a site in Naas, Balbriggan, St Kevin's Hospital in Cork, Colm Barracks in Mullingar, the Meath Hospital, and Dyke Road in Galway.
Okay. And any of your staff coming from NAMA?
The 3 current staff formerly worked in NAMA. We've been out of NAMA for about a year now.
All 3 out from NAMA?
Of the current staff, yeah.
Right. Would you say that to some degree the LDA is going to is having effectively to undo the damage that NAMA has done by selling, what is it, 40 billion worth of property at pretty low prices to developers who are now hoarding and speculating on vast amounts of land? And that, in fact, that's why you're needed, is to deal with the consequences of what NAMA did.
I don't think it's appropriate necessarily for me. I no longer work in NAMA. I don't think it's appropriate for me to speak for NAMA. NAMA is well able to account for themselves. But what I would say is this, that I'm not sure exactly where it's coming from that NAMA has somehow injured housing delivery. My understanding is that NAMA has, since 2014, 2015, funded and enabled the delivery of around 25% of all housing supply in the country, and that one of their core business models now is in relation to funding housing delivery.
But 25% of a pitifully low level of delivery, which everybody would accept, pitifully low.
Well,
in fact, we don't even know how low it is because we get different estimates of what actual delivery is. But by any stretch, I mean, if you take the CSO, 14,000 last year, it's pitifully low. Way below what we need now. What are the ESRI saying? We need 35,000 a year?
Yeah, I think you have to look back. NAMA was given a mandate by the Oireachtas, and the Oireachtas gave it the mandate.
Oh yeah, I went to Oireachtas mostly.
And it followed that mandate. And its job was to address the banking crisis. And that's what was set out for it in its legislation. And as part of that, to enhance its return, luckily it has been able to enable a very large proportion of housing delivery in this country. And so I think you have to look at its mandate and why it was set up to understand the context of
I understand its mandate, and I think its mandate was totally misguided. But nonetheless, I mean, it is the fact that it unloaded a vast amount of property at the bottom of the market, for the most part, and a huge amount of that is still nothing is happening with it. I mean, I think Mel Reynolds has estimated of that 114,000 that was mentioned earlier on, roughly, I can't remember the exact numbers, but about half of that is local authority and about half of that is NAMA. So there is, 60,000 zoned land, which could deliver 60,000 units sitting in the hands of NAMA, and nothing is happening with it, or very little is happening with it.
I think what you're asking me to do is to account for what NAMA is doing, and I think that while NAMA is best placed to account for itself in that respect, my view would be that NAMA has actually done quite a lot for housing supply in this country.
Okay, well, I think the housing crisis would say different now, to be honest. But anyway, we'll move on from that. But this is where it links into the big picture. I mean, by the way, I just want to say I am in favour of the idea, and I have argued for a centrally planned agency, although I think the local authorities should be the main sort of people delivering on the ground. But I think the idea of coordinating that in a strategic way and planning it and looking at what we've got and saying how do we deliver what we need, that is a correct idea. But I have a big problem with the fact that then within this plan 60% is going to be privatised. I think that creates huge problems because first of all, once you begin to interact with the private market, aren't we back to the problems that we've got with NAMA, that we're having to negotiate with people whose interest in the whole process is to make money, whose interest in the process is to make money, okay? And so the state has to then negotiate an arrangement with them where they make money out of land that we are giving them, and you're telling us we're going to service that land and so on, and you're trying to drive down the cost of the land so they're going to get it cheap, and then they're going to walk away with a profit, because they wouldn't be in it if they weren't going to walk away with a profit. I mean, that causes a whole number of difficulties. Fergus O'Dowd mentioned them earlier on. I mean, the whole question of transparency. Will we be able to find out the price at which the land is disposed? Probably not. Maybe you could tell me that. I mean, when you dispose of land, public land, to private developers, will we be able to know what the prices are? Will we be able to know what the conditionality around the sale of that land is in terms of delivery?
Just to touch on a couple of the points you made there, Deputy, I guess the reason why land in some locations is expensive in this country at the moment is because there's not enough of it coming through. So that's what we intend to remedy. And I think we can fundamentally impact the land market in that respect. In terms of developers walking away with a profit, as I mentioned earlier, the development process and the delivery process, the bit at the end isn't necessarily the largest part of that in terms of profitability. It's all the piece that happens beforehand, and the land assembly and the planning and the zoning work that's done and the servicing. So that's where a lot of the profitability is made, and that will be where state lands are involved, captured for the state's benefit, as well as increasing the supply of land, which should help moderate the cost of land, which should feed into housing affordability. So that's the bigger picture with the LDA. In terms of transparency, I totally understand the need for accountability and transparency, and as we go through the design of the LDA, through its legislation, and when the board is appointed, that's going to be a primacy for us to make sure that this committee and the Oireachtas and all stakeholders have full confidence in respect of the LDA and its dealings. There will be some tempering of that perhaps, and we have to work out the details on this yet, in respect to the confidentiality of any commercial arrangements that are got into. But transparency and accountability is our primacy in terms of the design approach that we're taking at the moment.
But to be honest, that doesn't really answer my question. I mean, simply asserting that you're very cognizant of the need for transparency, right? But what you're also saying is then we have the commercial sensitivity stuff. And I just don't see how these two things marry. Because, you know, in answer to the direct question, will we know what price you sell land to private developers for? I think the answer is no, right? Unless you're going to tell me that we are going to know.
Just to be fair, because the legislation hasn't come before us yet, and you probably don't have the final answers to those questions, that will be coming back before the committee for pre-legislative scrutiny, and I would presume that all those answers or those questions will be answerable then when you have definitive answers on them. So if there's a way that you can answer it, great, but I understand if you can't.
Yeah, thanks, Cahir. Look, I think that's correct. But again, our bias is towards maximising transparency and accountability, but ultimately it'll be decided by the Oireachtas.
Yeah, okay, last question is this, right? Under Rebuilding Ireland, the government have identified a requirement to deliver 137,000 social housing units, okay? Now, if they actually deliver them, that will account for pretty much all projected housing development, because ESRI are saying we need about 35,000 a year, right? So for the next 4 years, to deliver on Rebuilding Ireland, everything is going to have to be social housing. Now it's not, because 100,000 of that under Rebuilding Ireland is going to be HAPS. In other words, we're expecting the private sector to deliver it, and then we're going to rent it back from the private sector. That's the plan. Okay, so would I be right in saying that that's essentially what you're going to be doing, is trying to deliver on those targets, where instead of us directly ensuring those targets are met by the state itself building the public and affordable housing, we're going to deliver a small portion of it directly, and the rest you're going to work with private developers to build on public land for the most part, and then the state will end up renting that stuff back from the developers we've just given it to, or sold it to, should I say. Because that's the balance of the targets, right? I mean, those are the targets. 37,000 directly delivered by the state itself. Of the 137,000, the 100,000 to be HAPS, RAS and leasing. Now, but that's all to be social housing. So, like, I don't see how anything else is even going to happen other than that. But isn't there something a bit mad about that? That yous are going to help deliver a small proportion of Rebuilding Ireland directly in conjunction with local authorities and AHBs, but the majority of it you're going to flog off to developers who, if we're to meet the targets, will then have to lease it back to the state.
I can just speak for the LDA and what the LDA is going to do. So, in respect of the larger Rebuilding Ireland targets, we can touch on those separately. But I guess, firstly, it's not that we're just selling out to private developers without any delivery commitments or without retaining any interest ourselves in schemes. The LDA will seek to retain interest in schemes. That could be through licensing or other arrangements that gets value for the taxpayer and the state, but also that ensures delivery. Not all of those will be necessarily rented back to people on the open market. Normal people will be buying these homes and getting mortgages and buying them and living in them as owner-occupiers themselves. So it's not that it will all go back into private rental. As well as that, to try and assist with affordability measures, as you know, we're targeting 30%, well, we have to have a minimum of 30% delivery on state lands as affordable. And one of the tenures that we're trying to develop in that respect, which is still new in this country, is cost rental, which pares back the rental level down to the minimum needed to cover the actual cost of producing that unit. So I think these are very positive developments for affordability, as well as the wider picture of enhancing affordability through better land supply management?
Just very last question, Chair.
We're supposed to finish at 10:30, Richard, and I haven't come in yet.
Oh, fair enough.
So 10 seconds.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think overall the maths doesn't work out. But can I just ask you this? Brendan Kenny said to us the other day, if the council builds stuff directly on their own lands, that they have one place to go, one port of call, that's the department, get approval, get the money, and so on. Whereas with all this mixed tenure stuff, you're going to have to essentially have 3 ports of call, am I right? That you'll have the local authority, department for the public housing element, then another sort of set of financing arrangements around the affordable housing element, and then another set of financing arrangements around the bits that you dispose to the private developers.
Yeah. No, that's not the case, and absolutely we want to make sure, Deputy, that the Land Development Agency assists and enables the work of the local authorities in relation to their various housing functions and doesn't add any operational or other complexity. So, coming back to the fundamental function of the Land Development Agency, it is a land agency. It's about, in effect, broadening the supply of delivery options for development in the broadest of senses, as well as housing, beyond that is currently available to the market and to local authorities as well. And everything that from a policy point of view, in terms of how we build the legislation and so on, it will be very much about dovetailing with the existing systems and processes that we have, which we know, we are continually enhancing and improving in relation to the approval of social housing delivery programmes more generally. So we, from a departmental point of view and a policy point of view, absolutely, we do not want the Land Development Agency to be adding in any shape or form to the burden that local authorities already have to handle in the context of their statutory functions, EU requirements, directives and whatnot, procurement. We want this to actually assist.
And I'm just going to finish up in this session just to say I do welcome the Land Development Agency, and I know it's taken a long time to come to fruition, so I actually very much welcome the overarching principle of what you're trying to do here, because up to date it has been piecemeal. But I do want to ask, in relation to local authorities where we're trying to work collaboratively with and have shared responsibility with, additional to physical resources that you will implement where required, what other additional supports can you give local authorities, in particular on sites of, say, over 100 or 500 units where it's taken a long time to get to a certain point? I take great offence to anybody using words like flogging off state land as if we're just going to throw it away and get nothing back in return. I think that's a little bit misleading. But I mean, I fully concur with what you're saying. The initial part of bringing a land or bringing a site to a point where it can be developed is extremely costly. And if it is more beneficial to then flip that and get something back in return, i.e. 30% affordable or public-private partnerships, joint ventures, then we have to examine those proposals in detail and look at what's in the best interest of value for the state. The 10% baseline that keeps coming up, that is a baseline. I think people are misconstruing that. That is a minimum requirement. Nowhere does it say that that can't be exceeded or increased, as well as the 30% affordability on the particular sites that were mentioned earlier. And is it true to say on some sites outside Dublin, most likely, that there will be a natural affordability on those sites? And that's never mentioned. And what's never mentioned either is, and I can point to one particular site in Dunleary where we have 50 social houses in Fitzgerald Park about to be delivered this year. And it took years to get to this point, and they're magnificent homes of a really high standard that we're providing for families to give them a safe environment to raise their families. Nobody ever asked for 10% affordable on those. Nobody ever asked for the mixed tenure on those sites. And I think sometimes there can be an imbalance on that side too. Now, bearing in mind the most vulnerable in society, we have to look after them first. But affordability is as big a problem as social housing is. And so for that reason, I very much welcome the initiative of the Land Development Agency and principally what you're set to do. When it comes to the board that will be put in place, I would presume that those people on that board would be highly qualified and have vast experience to deal with what's ahead of us here. And while people can talk about people's salaries or misconstrue them in any way they want. If you want to get qualified people with experience from the private sector, you have to pay them accordingly. If you want them to leave very valuable jobs, they have to be paid accordingly. And in return for that, then we have transparency, and that we're all aware, and we can question them, and they're accountable to the Oireachtas and to everybody else. But I do think that, you know, to get qualified, vastly experienced people, they have to be paid accordingly. When it comes to the social housing targets that we have in local authorities, it's a bit, again, like the 10% baseline. They're targets. They're not a minimum requirement. They are to be exceeded, and they're expected to be exceeded. So in relation to that, I'm just wondering how the Land Development Agency will, again, collectively, shared responsibility, help those local authorities where possible.
Thanks, Cahir. If I could just touch on a couple of points you made and hopefully answer your queries. We did talk about, and a good example of the resourcing support that we can lend is in relation to one of our initial sites in the initial portfolio, the Dyke Road site in Galway. And you asked, is there anything else that we can do in this respect? And one of the things that we're looking to do is to take blockages out of the system at the moment, to understand where those blockages are and what we can do to smooth them over. And people often talk about procurement as being a blockage. That could be in relation to procuring professional services or perhaps procuring a builder or a developer partner. And what we're looking to do is to, from the ground up, design our procurement frameworks for both those segments, so that's the professionals and then the development side, as slickly and as tightly as possible, to take as much time as possible out of that. And what we're also looking to do is to make those panels available for use by anyone in the public sector, including local authorities. So we're hoping that we can make a meaningful and material improvement to helping with those blast through those blockages that are there sometimes on the procurement side. You also mentioned that it's unfair to term the involvement of developer partners as flogging off state land, as on the private side, where private development takes place on sites, that we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that delivery happens within time-bound commitments. So it's not that the site's gone and it's for the developer to do with what he or she pleases. It's that we will put time-bound delivery restrictions in terms of the commercial transactions that we undertake with those developers, where we do engage those practices. I also note your point in relation to natural affordability, especially outside Dublin, and some of the sites, and especially some of the larger ones that we have, including in Dublin, where private sales happen, they tend to be at the more affordable end of the scale. And I think you also mentioned the point that affordability is as big a problem as social housing, and that's true. So the more supply that we have coming into that space, the better, as far as I'm concerned, especially where that supply is at the affordable end of the scale. And ultimately, when you look at what we're trying to do, the competition takes place in 3 different areas in the development process. So that's in buying the land, and that's in the second piece is in the development piece itself, so the methodologies you use to develop, and the third piece is in the sales of the houses when they're built. All the competition currently is in buying the land, because there's not enough of it coming out. That's where we're going to help to put more land in there, so to put the competition into the space of developing the house and into the space of selling the house. That's where we want competition, and we're going to help with that by supplying land into those segments. That's all I'd have to say, Cahir, in relation to your comments. Happy to elaborate if you wish.
Thanks. Now, do you have anything to find out? No. We have gone half an hour over time. Owen, have you something that you want to say in 10 seconds?
Yeah. Apologies, I had to pop out to speak in the chamber. I just want to emphasise one point, John.
Yeah.
When you spoke about Drum, you talked about the comparison between if it was sold privately and there would only be 10% Part 5 and the LDA model, which is 40%. But of course, that's not really an appropriate comparison because it's public land. The real comparison should be utilising 100% of that to meet social and affordable housing need, or just to meet whether it's 40 or 45 or whatever ends up. So all I'd like to impress on you is to think about this isn't the same as using Part 5 of the Planning and Development Act. And when you come back to us in legislation, we'll be looking very carefully to see what the targets are on those, and obviously we'll be engaging with you at that point. The strategic land management function is absolutely spot on. But in the example you gave, for example, with Galway, all you brought to the table was additional resources. The department could have done that themselves without you to assist the council, and they would have been able to function just as well as they are with you. So you've a long way to go to make the case for the thing that's in front of you, and I look forward to engaging with you when you come back at the legislative stage.
Can I ask a clarification on that, though, because there was over 700 staff approved for local authorities in relation to delivery around housing. But one of the problems that we're hearing from local authorities is the amount of time it takes to actually appoint somebody through the Public Appointments Board. And by the time that actually goes through, they might have been picked up by the private sector. So where the Land Development Agency kicks in, is that you have that resource there and ready, and that so you're not stuck in one local authority, you could help at that time, solve that problem and then move on. Is that the key mechanism of that?
I think so, Cahir. Look, and just to touch to the Deputy's point there, look, I'm very encouraged that everyone buys into the idea of the active land management role of the agency, because that is the core role. Where, and I wouldn't focus too much on the ancillary activities that we can bring in respect of providing resources and things like that, because the core role of the agency, the core selling point, the core rationale for setting up the agency is active land management, and I'm very encouraged that everyone in the committee seems to agree with that.
Thanks, John. You're okay? Members, okay? Okay. Members, can I thank our witnesses for attending today, John Colm and Niall Cousins, and hopefully if that legislation is drafted and ready for pre-legislative scrutiny, then the committee might allow us to do that before Christmas, and we might have you in again. But can I thank you very much for your attendance today, and apologies we did run over. And members, I propose that we suspend for a couple of minutes just to allow our second round of witnesses to take their seats. Is that agreed? Thanks. In our second session today, we'll continue our consideration on the topic of the appropriate use of public land. I would like to welcome to South Dublin County Council Mr Colm Ward, from Fingal County Council Ms Anne-Marie Farrelly and Ms Mary Egan, and from Cork City Council Ms Anne Doherty and Mr Brian Geaney, and from Dún Laoghaire Ms Catherine Keenan and Ms Mary Henchy. Before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Mr Ward to make his opening statement.
Thanks, Chair and committee members. The following challenges are critical to the considerations of South Dublin County Council regarding the appropriate use of public land for housing delivery: ensuring sufficient supply of homes across South Dublin, determining the appropriate mix of private, social and affordable homes to be delivered on available sites and across the county, utilising the full range of options envisaged by national policy for delivery of homes while having regard for the location, infrastructural requirements and social context. I have provided below an overview of the status of our housing supply programme across South Dublin for current projects, future plans and proposals under consideration, together with the status and an indicative number of over 800 homes. This shows our commitment to the delivery of social homes on available land within the county. In relation to the larger sites available to the Council for delivery of homes, the recently approved Kilcarbery project has been through a 2-year process of master planning, legal and financial modelling, competitive dialogue and procurement. The Council's elected members approved the disposal of the 72-acre site at Kilcarbery for the development of 975 housing units, 294 of which will be for social housing. This development is in tandem with and adjacent to 109 houses approved as part of the initial PPP bundle, giving an overall mix of 40% social and 60% private on this now fully planned, integrated community, which will also benefit from a creche, community centre, school and retail centre. This project commenced in the absence of an affordable housing scheme, but with the Council fully cognizant of its role both as a housing and planning authority and the need for the provision of homes in line with Pillar 3 of Rebuilding Ireland. The enabling infrastructure works are being funded through the LIHAF fund. 50 homes will be sold at a discount to market prices to offset the drawdown value of the LIHAF funding. This project also includes a social employment clause stipulating that 10% of person hours are for those on the local register of long-term unemployed. The next stage involves the preparation of the environmental impact statement and application to onboard Planola as a strategic housing development by the successful tenderer to secure phased delivery of homes on site commencing in 2020 and being completed by 2023. In addition to providing for the delivery of much needed homes, the economic yield to the Council from the sale will enable the strategic acquisition of additional land for future housing development. We've shared the detail of the Kilcarbery model both with the Department and with other local authorities, and our team will continue to make themselves available for consultation and to offer guidance on the process to others developing similar plans. With the benefit of this experience, there are 4 other large strategic sites owned by the Council and intended for housing development in a similar manner. These are Kilnarden, Rathcoole, Clonburris STZ and St Mailruns. These are currently being allocated to consultants for high-level master planning in conjunction with our internal team to assess the potential unit capacity, the infrastructural requirements and the social and environmental context. The budget announcement around affordable housing is very welcome and now allows this tenure to be factored into plans for these sites. We have also advised the Department of our intention to apply for funding from the Service Sites Fund in 2019 in respect of each. These sites comprise a range of contrasting characteristics including greenfield, brownfield, urban, rural, town centre, SDZ, adjacent to large areas of social housing and on the outskirts of a rural village. These characteristics will inform the master planning context and the potential distribution of social, affordable and private housing on each site. This mix will be developed in conjunction with the local elected members and informed by best practice and national policy around housing integration and sustainable communities. It is estimated that all 5 sites, including Kilcarbery, will yield circa 4,300 homes. As a housing authority, it is our view that the sites will have different solutions which will all include provision for social, affordable and private housing. There are currently 7,055 applicants on the Council's housing list, and we will continue to examine opportunities for infill housing, turnkey acquisitions including through Part 5, and partnerships with approved housing bodies to supplement the major housing supply projects on our available land. In addition, the housing solutions provided through RAS, HAP and leasing options are all actively being pursued and utilised in South Dublin. The current actions and future plans outlined above demonstrate the strategic approach being undertaken by South Dublin County Council to ensure the effective use of available land across the county to deliver an optimum integrated housing mix to meet the housing need for the people of South Dublin.
Forward. Just before I go on, we have all your opening statements. Feel free to read them out in totality if you want, or if you want to just scan through them. Most of us will have read through the statements already, so I'll leave that up to yourselves to decide. So now call on Ms Doherty to read out her opening statement.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I will do as you suggest. I might just focus on some of the key points on the opening statement. So just by way of introduction, first and foremost to thank the committee for the invitation to address you about appropriate use of public lands. And our statement is an attempt to address both land supply and its importance for housing, and the most critical issue that now needs to address for Cork to continue its growth in terms of what's envisaged for it under Project Ireland 2040. The statement is structured to identify the major areas of public land owned in the city and the strategic priorities that will guide the continuing development of that land under the framework of Project 2040. Currently, our strategic projects are set out in the City Development Plan, our local LECP plan, and also Cork 2050, which was a joint strategic pathway developed by both Cork City and Cork County Council as part of the development and contribution to the National Planning Framework. Our city is due to expand substantially in the next local elections, and we'll see growth in the area of our city increasing from 37.3 kilometres square to 187 kilometres square, a 5-fold increase. And the population of that expanding city is due to grow very significantly as projected under Ireland 2040. But that also plan anticipates that 50% of the increase in that population has to be accommodated within the existing built-up area. And in tandem with that, population growth for the wider metropolitan Cork is also due to extend very significantly. In terms of economic development, lots of encouraging things are happening, but underlying the urgency of addressing the housing supply shortage and the existence of which presents a whole set of challenges is very important. Not only is the supply issue a social challenge, equally now it's an economic challenge. Unless we tackle it, it's clearly a potential obstacle to the future employment and economic growth of Cork City. Early resolution of these issues will reap long-term rewards in local and regional tourism, enterprise development, foreign direct investment, aside from the obviously quality of life and livability benefits of a vibrant, compact waterfront city, literally a harbour of opportunities. To achieve these development targets, the city needs land to develop. The primary need at present is for that housing and its associated infrastructure. The table in the document sets out for you an estimated total yield on zoned land based on the existing city boundary, what's estimated without infrastructure and the potential yield from that in terms of where there is infrastructure requirement and where there isn't. Development activity in the city is showing strong signs after the period of recession. However, actual construction on housing and apartment developments, with the marked exception of our own social housing construction programme, remains slow. The most active private sector in the city at the moment is student housing, with a number of beds being constructed and obviously others with planning permission. The Cork City Council was here at you previously earlier in the summer, and we identified a number of issues that we felt were facing housing supply in the city. And as you suggested, Chair, I won't go through them, but obviously scarcity of land, growing population, changing demographics, tendency towards urban living, the need for sustainable communities, lack of investment from existing older stock, and our own autonomy in terms of decision making and the viability issues. These issues, unfortunately, still remain as the primary challenges with respect to housing supply in Cork City. Focusing now particularly on public lands, we've outlined for you in the document the public lands that we've identified in public ownership in the current city. There's currently 155.15 hectares of publicly owned land, and I've set out in the document the different stakeholders. So ourselves, as Cork City Council, have a land holding of 41.25 hectares, of which we're actively pursuing 34.9 hectares at the moment. There are two significant developments in that. One is we are the freehold owner of a land bank in Old Whitechurch Road on the north side of our city, and which was assembled many, many years ago, and with an ambition for residential purposes. It's got 22 hectares and a southerly sloping greenfield site zoned in the development plan for residential. We've been working to unlock the potential of that land because it has some very significant infrastructure challenges with power lines and other road infrastructures, and we've accessed and committed to a local infrastructure activation fund to do the infrastructure work that's required to bring this land to market and to development. The land bank itself is a really accessible site in terms of being proximal to the Blackpool Retail and Business Park, and also close to the city in terms of neighbourhoods. Our vision for that land bank is to have it fully developed to provide sustainable housing. Estimated capacity, again only estimated, of 600 units, subject obviously to planning permission, and we do envisage that that would be a mixed development across all the needs across housing, and also an associated neighbourhood centre on that land to balance obviously the prevalence of social housing in the northern part of the city. We also have a site in Boherboy Road on the northeast of our city. We have successfully achieved planning permission from our neighbouring local authority and we have approval for 147 units. We've made an application to the Service Sites Fund for that, operated by the Department of Housing and Planning and Local Government, and we intend to develop that as a mixed scheme of both social and affordable housing. We're waiting for approval, but we're very optimistic that that's very forthcoming. The other stakeholders are listed, ranging across the HSE, ESB, Erin Road Éireann, the Port of Cork, Bord na Móna, Department of Defence, Bord Gáis and IDA. And as you said, Chair, I'm conscious you've read them. We've engaged with all of these stakeholders, so we have a fairly good understanding of where they are at in relation to that land. These lands obviously are a real resource in our city, and it's our position that they should be brought forward for development for as soon as is practicable. We've already notified the department in relation to that, and we have already met with the Land Development Agency once, and we have another meeting just about to be scheduled in order to progress our thinking and thoughts collectively on this. These lands are also zoned for development and have potential to make massive contribution to sustainable development in our city, but obviously we would caution that our proper urban design principles have to be adhered to, and not a temptation of only short-term needs addressed, which obviously we would recommend would be avoided in terms of future-proofing. We also have an ask that there is a lot of underutilised private lands, particularly probably adjacent to the city more than a city itself, because most of it we've probably brought forward through our public housing scheme, but we do feel that that's something that also needs to be addressed. So in conclusion, Chair, we have encouraging developments on the supply of housing due to our enhanced social delivery programme, but we still have a significant impediment in terms of the other housing solutions in our city. I hope our paper is helpful. We're very available to ask any questions.
Thank you, Ms Harty, and then I'd call Ms Egan for opening statement. Or Ms Farrelly, is it? Sorry.
Look, and committee members, my name is Anne-Marie Farrelly. I'm Director of Planning and Strategic Infrastructure with Fingal County Council, and I'm joined by my colleague Mary Egan from the Council's Housing Department. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee and to discuss the appropriate use of public lands. The focus of this statement is the Council's approach to the development and use of public lands for the provision of housing and sustainable communities. Fingal is the second largest of the 4 Dublin local authorities and has the 3rd biggest local authority catchment area in the country. The results from the census 2016 show that Fingal is Ireland's fastest growing county with the youngest population, and Balbriggan is the youngest town in the country. The Council supports the ongoing development of the county in accordance with the national, regional and local planning frameworks, which Fingal has actively contributed to. And the Council is also committed to ensure that the area develops in a sustainable way and supports the key principles of healthy placemaking, climate action and economic opportunity. It is Fingal's priority, in view of the current housing crisis, to form effective and innovative approaches to mobilise development in both public and private lands and to create housing in quality urban neighbourhoods. Consequently, any development, including that of public land, is positioned against the national, regional and local policies and objectives. To this end, Rebuilding Ireland, the National Planning Framework, the Fingal Development Plan, LIAF and other such policies and programmes set the context for future development. These enabling policies are now in place and will facilitate Fingal in developing sustainable communities. Facilitating the provision of the right quantity of appropriate housing in the right location that is accessible and affordable for all residents is crucial for Fingal County Council. To this end, there are currently 72 active private development sites, which will deliver over 12,000 homes in the county. There is also existing planning permission in place for a further 55 sites, with capacity to deliver over 5,000 homes. The provision of housing in Fingal, as with all planning authorities, requires facilitating policies and principles within the County Development Plan and the core strategies. These policies enable the delivery of quality dwellings and help create and maintain sustainable communities and neighbourhoods. In Fingal, we've employed a number of policy responses to facilitate housing development, namely the adoption of a core strategy, which allows for the development of 49,000 housing units and more than 1,700 hectares of zoned land. To ensure the development of sustainable communities that are economically, environmentally and socially healthy and resilient, significant master planning has been carried out and is ongoing. Furthermore, a number of local area plans are in place across the county and others under draft. Hansfield Strategic Development Zone in Dublin 15 continues to work as a successful policy tool with a high rate of completions in Q2 2018. We are on target to deliver in excess of 2,000 homes in 2018. That compares to a figure 10 years ago in 2008 of 2,700, and the trend is favourably upwards. In 2014, for example, there were 300 completions, so there's been a significant change in recent years. We recognise the benefits of parallel delivery of supporting infrastructure, and a review of critical infrastructure required to unlock the significant residential zoned and serviced land banks available in Fingal was undertaken as part of the Fingal Development Plan in 2015. On the back of the work carried out at that stage, in terms of the infrastructure audit, the Council sought funding from Central Government LIHAF initiative launched in August 2016. We were successful in securing total LIHAF funding of 26 million for essential infrastructure acquired in 3 multi-unit housing development sites. That was the second highest allocation of the 13 local authorities who were successful in 2017. In the short to medium term, LIA funding will unlock 2,200 residential units on lands in Donabate, Swords and Baldoyle, and approximately 7,000 residential units will be delivered in the longer term. We are actively planning the development of 5 key publicly owned sites for housing. 3 of the sites are council-owned and they are located at Balmstone, Donabate, Kappa Dublin 11 and Churchfields, Mulhuthert, and 2 are housing agency-owned sites, and they are at Castlelands, Balbriggan and Hackettstown, Skerries. And we have engaged with the Land Development Agency in relation to those sites in recent weeks. The Council's vision for these lands is to deliver successful and sustainable communities through the provision of high quality and attractive residential developments with a focus on best practice urban design and layout, and the provision of accessible community, open space and recreational facilities. These developments will provide an appropriate mix of house types, house sizes and tenure to meet household needs and to promote balanced communities. These lands are key locations for population and employment growth, aligned with committed infrastructural investments. Project Tallaght is an internal project office in Fingal and has been set up to coordinate and manage the development of these lands. The Programme Office analyses proposals to select the best approach to the projects, and it coordinates resources to procure, manage and deliver each project. It is essential these lands are developed in the most advantageous and efficient way for the Council, and to this end the development approach is tailored for the individual requirements of each site and the adjoining area. Fingal County Council is working collaboratively with relevant stakeholders to ensure the development of housing across these sites is facilitated. Our strategy is one that supports the creation of sustainable communities. We cater for all members of society and seek to deliver a range of house types and sizes which will provide more opportunities for people to stay and live locally at every stage of their lives. In simple terms, we want Fingal to grow in an organic, sustainable way and ensure a seamless integration between established and new communities. The development plan sets the parameters for the development of these sites, and it is envisaged that up to 3,730 homes could be provided here. I've included a lot of information on the individual sites in the statement. I won't go through each of the sites presently, but we are open to working with all types of housing providers for a mix of tenure perspectives, such as private house builders and approved housing bodies who may work together in developing each of the sites. In total, the sites provide 100 hectares of development land. They are all zoned for housing and have the potential, as I mentioned previously, to deliver in excess of 3,700 units. In conclusion, Fingal County Council acknowledges the role that these strategically located sites can play in the wider Fingal region in terms of their potential to support a high quality of life with the offer of culture and heritage and access to the coast, waterways and city and airport. As such, Fingal is focused on delivering successful and sustainable communities through the provision of high quality housing and physical and social infrastructure and improving connections between new and existing communities. We recognise that no one-size-fits-all approach is available to the use of public lands and the delivery of housing. Realising a mix of solutions which work for individual sites is our current priority.
I'd now like to call on Ms Keenan for her opening statement.
Chair, members, Oireachtas County Council welcomes the opportunity to make a submission to the Joint Committee on Planning, Housing and Local Government. My name is Catherine Keenan and I'm here in the context of my role as Director of Housing, and along with my colleague Mary Henchy, Director of Planning. I just try and focus my speech on the actual, on the main points rather than reading it through. The submission was compiled to have regard to the broader topic of appropriate use of public land, with a specific emphasis on Murbook Shangana lands, as circulated with the invitation to attend the meeting. The Regional Planning Guidelines for the Greater Dublin Area 2010 to 2022 forecast a population of approximately 240,000 in DLR by 2022. This equates to the provision of circa 1,500 homes per annum over a period of 6 years. The Q2 2018 DLR Housing Task Force returns for sites greater than 10 homes show that in DLR there are 41 active sites that account for circa 1,300 homes. currently under construction. And in the first 8 months of this year, planning permissions were granted for 3,790 homes, which is more than treble the figure for 2017. The primary challenge for DLR is providing the infrastructure required to open up our new growth areas of Kiltiernan, Glenamuck, Woodbrook, Shangana, Cherrywood, Stepaside and Sandyford. DLR has already maximised the use of the bulk of its viable service lands, in particular smaller infill developments of 2 to 50 homes, in conjunction with the downsizing campaign. Since 2015, a total of 120 social homes have been completed, with a further 4 sites, 129 homes currently on site. DLR is at tender stage with a further 19 homes and at feasibility stage with 729 homes, including Shangana Castle site. In addition, DLR is working in partnership with 3 approved housing bodies to develop a further 208 homes. DLR saw the fastest surge in prices in the capital in July 2018, with prices up by 9.8%. In contrast, South Dublin saw an increase of just 5.2%. The median price for Dublin as a whole was $360,000 in July, while in DLR it was $527,000, compared with $320,000 for both Fingal and South Dublin. The affordability problem is therefore somewhat unique to DLR, and it is extremely important that DLR seeks to maximise affordability on its own lands. DLR is now commencing development of its larger sites, including Shangana Castle site, which are located mainly in the southern part of the county. Larger sites will naturally take longer to build out. However, when we move into larger sites, there are economic, financial, planning and environmental considerations which add to the complexity of delivery. In terms of planning, in line with the EAI directive, certain developments, including Shangana Castle site, must be assessed for likely environmental effects before planning permission can be granted. Planning applications under Part 10 go directly to An Bord Pleanála. This applies to the Shangana Castle site, as it has more than 500 dwellings. Tenders for the master plan to prepare for a scheme for compliance with the EAI directive in preparation for Part 10 planning were sought in Q1 2018. The integrated design team has commenced their work, and the preparation for this stage is expected to take at least 9 months. In terms of the public spending code, which was introduced in 2013 and provides for best value for money for public funds, it introduced a set of rules and procedures for projects with a value over 20 million. Under this code, DLR is obliged to carry out a cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness analysis, must consider the option of a PPP and is obliged to engage with the NDFA to examine finance and apportionment of the risk and balance sheet considerations. Projects are reviewed by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government and also peer-reviewed by DEPR. Assuming an average bill cost of $250,000, then the public spending code applies on sites over 80 homes. The public spending code applies to Shangana Castle with a value of 132 million. DLR is working with the NDFA to develop funding options for Shangana, and at the same time, in order to expedite matters, we have appointed a design team to progress the master plan in preparation for Part 10 planning. In conclusion, DLR is actively managing its land bank and is now moving into large sites which have more complexities in terms of delivery. And as outlined in the submission, the public spending code provides for important procedures to ensure best value for money. However, it may be helpful if the threshold could be increased to allow for quicker build of more than 80 homes. Downsizing incentives would also assist in making better use of our housing stock for larger families on the waiting list. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keenan. Eoin.
Chair, thank you very much. And folks, thanks very much for taking the time to come in. I suppose 2 things just to start. First of all, I absolutely appreciate that you're operating within government policy, so while in the privacy of your own offices you might have your own views on some of the things we're going to discuss, I accept that you're constrained by that government policy. But I suppose just to put in context the concerns that some of us have, see, one of the reasons why many members of this committee are getting so exercised about land is because the more we look at it, there's a mismatch between the targets for the delivery of particularly social but also affordable housing and what is being promised in terms of delivery through Rebuilding Ireland and the other mechanisms. So just by way of example, we know from the most recent housing needs assessment there's about 73,000 households on the council waiting lists. But we've 40,000 households on HAP and we've another 19,000 households in RAS, and particularly in Dublin, RAS is undergoing some real difficulties. So in real terms, that means there is a real social housing need for about 132,000 units. Yet Rebuilding Ireland is only going to meet 23% of that need through units owned by local authorities and approved housing bodies. Colm will know in the local authority that we share, The figure is just a little bit better. It's about 27% of need will be met on the basis of the government's targets. So that means when we look at land, particularly the larger tracts of land, many of us are thinking of how can we make the case for a larger delivery of social housing on that land to meet that growing need. And the issue of affordability is the same. Like, we still don't have a measure for how many people out there, how many households need affordable rental or affordable sale. There was one very important piece of research that was published in June, and it hasn't got enough attention. We will be looking at it in the committee in the new year, but I flag it with everybody I'm talking to. Corrigan Foley and a number of other ESRI economists have done a very detailed study looking at affordability since 2003. And what they've found is in people renting and paying mortgages but not getting social housing supports, 32% are paying more than 30% of their income on accommodation. But more worryingly, in the bottom 25% of income earners, the percentage of people spending more than 30% of their income is 70%. So you can see already just in those initial figures, there's a huge level of need. And one of the worrying things about their study is it's not just now. They actually say that their modelling back to 2003 shows that that's a structural feature of our system. The only reason I'm saying that is because not only are we only going to meet about 23% of real social housing need from now till 2021 on the basis of government's targets, we've no notion of how far we're going to be from meeting social or affordable rental and affordable purchase need. So my concern is, and I would like you to try and say as much as you can within the limits that you're operating under, is the conversation we've just had with the Department and the Land Development Agency is essentially about taking very large tracts of public land and constraining the extent to which they can meet social affordable housing need because of the use of the joint venture structure that's there. And I'd be interested to know, for example, if your local authorities had all of the advantages that the LDA is going to have, if you didn't have to do the value for money exercises for the larger projects, if you didn't have to go through the cumbersome approval process and you had more flexibility in terms of tendering and employment of staff, if you had the very large multi-annual funding that they're going to have, I presume you would be able to deliver larger scale mixed income, mixed tenure projects like Shangana without the need of help from anybody, or maybe a little bit of oversight from the department. And if you're willing to put on record, and I understand if you're not, surely that would be a better way of meeting that need. One of the dilemmas we have is we all support the Shangana Castle project. It's a brilliant project. And from everything that I know from talking to the chair and councillors locally, it's designed to meet the needs there. One of the difficulties in Colm, I don't want to mention the war, but one of the difficulties some of us have with Kilcarbery is it's a really great project in its design. Right? It's really well integrated. It has land for schools, it has a community centre, it has retail. Just the great tragedy of it is 70% of the units in the joint venture won't be affordable, or certainly the vast majority they won't be. And I know, you've only come at the end of it, but we're trying to find ways of saying, are there not better ways of using the public land to meet social and affordable housing need? That's not to say that you couldn't use some of that land for market price houses, but surely it would be better if you guys were selling those houses and recycling the profits back into the housing system to meet other needs. So my questions are twofold. One is, if you had all of those powers that the LDA is going to get and those advantages, could you significantly increase your output above the current targets under Rebuilding Ireland? What are the constraints currently in place to prevent you, for example, from moving forward at a faster pace, for example, with the kind of a proposal that's in Shangana? And then in relation to Cork, I'm interested, because obviously you mentioned some issues in your presentation around the possibility of needing to review some of the constitutional, potential constitutional restrictions on accessing some of the private land. It's just if you had more specific thoughts on that, I would be very interested to know as well. Thanks, Chair.
So, sorry, just take note of your last one. I'm going to ask Mick to come in as well, because the questions are for everybody, so rather than having to keep going back in circles. Mick?
I'm going to direct my questions entirely to the delegation from Cork, so if you're happy for me to do it that way.
Yeah, that's okay, but we're all going to come in, and then at the end I'm going to ask the witnesses to answer.
Sure, okay. Well, look, what I'm going to do is I'll start actually on the point that Eoin finished it on there, because I think in Anne Doherty's presentation there is a very significant comment where she says that Cork City Council also urges the Government to address in appropriate circumstances underutilised private lands, even if this requires a re-examination of the protections currently afforded to private property in the Constitution. I think that's a significant statement from the Chief Executive Officer of one of the largest local authorities in the country. I would certainly draw attention to it, and I would support that statement myself. I'm going to not do the big block of talk. I'm looking for a little bit of back and forth here, okay? So I'm going to start about social and affordable housing need and use Cork City as an example of that. So I'll pose two questions to Anne and to Brian. The first one is about length of time on social housing waiting lists. We hear a lot about the numbers on the social housing waiting lists. We don't often discuss the length of time. And when I throw open the doors of my clinic on a Monday afternoon, I've got people coming into me now who've been on the housing list 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years, 12 years. Right? Are you in a position to give even an approximate profile of the position with the current social housing waiting list in Cork? How many people, for example, would be on the list more than 5 years? How many more than, say, 8 years? Because it seems to me that it's backing up an awful lot. On the question of getting in a picture of affordability, the Cork City Council CEO will know that I've had dealings in recent times with the firefighters in the city, and you know, we had a controversy there, and that's fine. But in the conversations that I held with firefighters, one of the things that struck me was how very few of them live in the city, and the amount of journey time they had to spend in the morning to come into work, or in the afternoon for their shift. Why? Can't afford housing in the city. Prices are too high. So here you have a group of workers who are, I would imagine, are at least on the average industrial wage, if not maybe a little bit more. Hope I'm not wrong there. They'll be soon letting me know. But I think it's the same for nurses, teachers and so on. Workers on average wages who just can't afford to buy in the city. Is that something that you think is exceptional, or do you think that that's part of the general picture? And if so, would you like to make a comment on that? And then perhaps I'll come back in and make my own points about social and affordable.
Mick, Richard?
Well, Mick has prompted one question, because I think people need to understand just how serious the situation is in Dún Laoghaire. Is the average waiting times, to my knowledge, from my clinic in Dún Laoghaire are now up to 9. Well, I don't know if it's average, but there's people on the list up to 19 years. But I would be interested to know if Catherine has what the average time is, but it's shockingly long time. And what I'd like to know, I suppose, is, does Catherine think we can meet the housing need, which, and maybe just you could clarify what the latest figures are in Dún Laoghaire, but outlining how many people are on the housing waiting list, but also how many are on HAPS transfer lists and on RAS.
Because I don't know if you'll have those answers with you, because we did ask our witnesses in around the appropriate use of public land, not around waiting lists. So I don't know if you have those figures to hand with you. If you do, great. If you don't, you might send them on to us afterwards. But just the topic was around appropriate use of public land. Yeah,
thanks for the steer, Chair, but I'm heading towards that, because what appropriate use of public land is depends very considerably on what the needs are. So it's very relevant, the issue of that. Yeah, and they might, but they can pass it on to me if they don't. They're still relevant questions. To meet that demand, which, you know, let's say it's in total, depending on how you calculate it, certainly 3.5, I would say probably more like 5,000 households in real terms over the next few years. and to get down those waiting lists, we'd have to have a very considerably higher level of delivery than we have currently. Now, I just don't see how we can do it with the plans we have for land use currently. I just don't see how we can do it, because if you take the Shangana site, we're only talking about 200 social houses. With the Part 5, maybe you can clarify how many Part 5 you expect to see delivered. I mean, you could sort of extrapolate from the figures you give on planning permissions, although even though those we don't know, getting the planning permission isn't the same as stuff actually being built. So, and all the rest of the sites that I can see, I mean, Shangana is still quite a way away. You're saying 9 months just to get through all these various bits and pieces that have to be done, and that's before, and then we have to sort of build and all that kind of stuff. But after that, I don't see where the rest is coming from for years. So, I mean, is that a fair assessment of the dilemma we face? And how then can we sort of accelerate that? And doesn't it necessitate us getting a much higher proportion of public housing on the lands that we do, rather than having to entertain things like PPPs and so on, which will lower the proportion of public housing that we get on those sites? Not mind the complications, and maybe you could sort of confirm. I mean, you seem to be saying the public spending code is limiting you, A, because of the threshold, and you urge that threshold rises. But is it also a big problem for you in trying to work out what affordability is, because of the requirement to have a proportion of affordable, and also you're saying a requirement to consider PPPs? So the need to consider the finances of all of that is slowing everything. You can't progress because you've got to consider a PPP, which is presumably related to the financing of the rest. And you have to consider affordable, and you're having difficulty because of the reasons you outlined, that the market is so inflated in Dún Laoghaire that trying to work out what affordable is and then how you finance it is a complexity. I mean, doesn't that all add up to saying it would actually be easier just to build out Shangana as public housing? Because you wouldn't have those problems, and you just go and have the whole site developed as public housing. And that would also mean that we would actually get somewhere close to meeting or hitting our targets in terms of social housing need. And the other thing I just wanted to ask as well is about, have you considered, I know I said it to Catherine before, and this was Mel Reynolds' suggestion, but I really think given the scale of the demand that we should consider this, is on sites like Cherrywood and other private development sites where we're waiting for them to deliver the social element, the Part 5 element, right? But we don't know when they're going to deliver it, and we don't get it till they're completed. And Mel Reynolds has said, why don't we take our 10% in land up front, and that way we aren't dependent on them. Now, if we did that in Cherrywood, that would give us 800 or land where we could build 800 houses. If we have to wait for the, 4 or 5 different developers own Cherrywood, we have no idea when that will be delivered. And we have to wait to the end of that process to get our bit. And we will be charged, or at least we'll have to negotiate prices with them, which are almost certainly going to be very high prices. So wouldn't it be better for us to get the land up front, the 10% off them up front, and just build out ourselves and not have to wait for them? Wouldn't that accelerate the delivery on the, on the Part 5?
I have a couple of general questions as well, in particular around downsizing options. This committee did a substantial report about housing options for older people, and we visited a number of sites where it is happening. And I am biased, and maybe not as au fait with the other 3 local authorities. Dún Laoghaire has been at the forefront of delivering housing options for older people, not least the launch that will be on Friday, the final phase of Rochestown Park. So I'm just wondering, what are we maximising the sites that we have in our towns and villages for downsizing for older people, or right sizing as we prefer to call it, because of the infrastructure that is needed around that? But also in the private sector, are we looking at state-owned land in these areas to do private housing for older people to right size if they choose to do so, optional? Just wondering, is there any policies around that we've looked at? I'm really interested to know what's involved, who's involved in your programme office team in Fingal, as well as in Dunleary. I would like to know the composite of that team, and if there is further resources that you think you need or require, or any barriers that you see happening in that area. And while Fingal referenced it, as well as Dunleary in their opening statement, I'd like to hear from all four local authorities what teams are in place in relation to delivery. In relation to Dunleary and the design team that was appointed in Q1, when did they actually initiate? When were they appointed as the design team, so that we know what the time is from then to 9 months? I share Richard's frustration with Shangana. It's mentioned in here countless times. I would differ in the proportions of what is social and affordable, but that's for the local authority to decide and the councillors to decide, not for us here to get into that detail of it here. But I do recognise the complexities around it, notwithstanding that it is frustrating. So I'm wondering what additional resources you think you may need to progress that quicker, or was there areas that we could have addressed from government side to deliver that quicker, notwithstanding the 2 tranches of LIHAF funding that were given. In relation to approved housing bodies, and I welcome the fact that Cork actually identified all the private site or semi-state lands as well that are available, but in relation to approved housing bodies, how proactive is each local authority in dealing with approved housing bodies? We have heard from AHBs that they have contacted various local authorities, not just Dublin, and they've been told that particular sites have already been identified for housing, and I've gone back and looked at some of those and I don't see any schemes for those sites, and I'm wondering what the confusion is there. In relation to cost rental, and I know it's a fairly new initiative, but has any of our local authorities before us identified sites for cost rental, apart from Enniskerry, which has been in the train for a long, long time and finally has been signed? And in relation to social housing, I actually want to commend the local authorities on developing sites, smaller sites, often more complex, more detailed, difficult sites to deal with, where they're trying to maximise either 8, 10, 20, 50 units, and that you have targeted those first because the quicker turnaround that can happen. And I do want to commend you in that area, albeit some local authorities haven't been able to do that, and I'm wondering what are the main barriers to doing that. And also to finalise that question, because we'll go back to yourselves next and then we'll do another round, is do you actually feel that we are maximising the sites that we have? So I can look at some sites around Dublin and I can see where there is apartment blocks all around them, and yet as a local authority we're only building 2-storey housing or a much smaller infill scheme, and I'm wondering why we're not maximising those sites. Is it because of sensitivity in the area? Is it because the amount of money that you can actually fund these projects, you're going for the smaller amount so you can turn it around quicker? Is there other reasons for that? Or is it if we maximise them, it's just too complex at this moment in time? And then the final one is, you have all referenced that funding is not the issue, that where you've commitment schemes, funding hasn't been a barrier, but we really want to tease through what the difficulties are between local authorities and the department. We're not on either side, we're actually just trying to arbitrate and tease through and facilitate. Some of us are, and try to facilitate that as much as possible. I've obviously attended all the housing summits, so I've heard a lot of the good work that is happening, which doesn't always get out into the media. But the recognising where we've come from and where we are now, I think we've turned a corner, but it has taken time, and I do want to recognise a lot of work has happened to get us to that point from the local authorities. But there is a lot of pinch points, and we all have particular sites in our own area that we're frustrated with. We recognise the complexities, but at some point we have to move forward. So just some general comments there. I don't know who wants to kick off. Colm, do you want to kick off first?
Well, just in relation to the LDA and the powers and resources, obviously we have to work through the detail of that's going to involve, and then we will see how we can work with them and work in tandem with them as we're completely open to, working in parallel or working jointly to free up land and sites. In terms of the resources we have, just in relation to Kilcarby, it was a high-level project team across the local authority. It wasn't a dedicated team, and we pulled in the outside expertise as we needed it. We have a significant tranche of staff, both in the Housing Department and the Architectural Services, working on all our projects, so we have resourcing through our workforce plan. In terms of the different sites and the different solutions, we're going to bring proposals for Clonburris, which will be approximately 2,000 homes, and that's going to be, in the main, affordable and social, because it's in the wider context of an SDZ that will have opportunity for 6,000 private homes. So we're focusing on the social and affordable element of that. But some of the other sites that we will have to look to, include private ownership, particularly the likes of Kilnarden, where there's a lot of social housing in the area. So different sites will require different solutions. In terms of affordability, obviously the new affordable housing scheme will be something to the fore of our mind. We progressed Kilcarby in the absence of that, and we were quite open about that all along, that we had to work within the constraints of policy. That will obviously follow on in terms of a cost rental scheme, and we're waiting for the detail of a cost rental scheme, because there's all sorts of views on what that will entail and how you future-proof it and the length of time that it will involve. In terms of Part 5, we're actively working with developers, and we're trying to front-load some of the units. I think if we get land, then we have to go through the process of whether it's Part 8 and developing that ourselves. Ideally, in a development, now I'm speaking in South Dublin, I know you referenced Dunleary, Deputy, but we will work to get the units front-loaded, and there's certain examples of that, such as Shackleton and so on, that we will be working to get units up front, and that's to the fore of our concern in that regard. In terms of the numbers on our housing list, I've identified 7,055. I don't have the average waiting time for a home. There are additional numbers on housing, on the transfer list and on the HAP list as well, but that feeds into a flow of, if people are accommodated in social housing, that frees up other options for people who don't have those options. We work with AHBs consistently, and we would aim to have around 400 units over the next couple of years from AHBs. Our Part 5 supply, you'd be looking at 500 units in the 2021 time frame as well. So on top of the 800 units we're delivering through our own smaller build programmes within housing local authority areas and green space and open space that we have, supplemented by the large sites, we have quite a significant supply pipeline that we're actively working on to deliver homes throughout the county.
Thanks, Colm. Ms. Farley, do you want to come in, or Ms. Egan?
I suppose to focus on how we've been approaching things, I suppose it has been a similar approach to what is proposed by the Land Development Agency, basically getting housing land ready for housing delivery. And I suppose using the time as your servicing sites to get ready to have the housing delivered. And that's through your typical methodologies in terms of joint ventures, direct delivery by ourselves, and I suppose at times more active collaboration with the private sector. We've done the site-by-site assessment of the potential of the individual sites and the constraints on the individual sites. So we know the sites well, and then that allows us to plan how those sites might be delivered. In terms of our project office, it's very much a project management approach, drawing across the expertise that's already available across the departments in the council, our housing staff, our planning, architects and engineering staff, and then where necessary bringing in outside expertise to assist as well. So it is very similar to the approach of the Land Development Agency. What we found in Fingal is the higher the number of active sites, the more ability you have to have short-term delivery. So the key thing is to have more sites active. Large sites deliver at a similar pace to the smaller sites. So where the Land Development Agency can assist us is that they will have more sites active. So where we have 5 key public housing sites, 3 of those are being progressed by ourselves. The additional 2 will now come earlier to the market because of the Land Development Agency's involvement. In terms of maximising the site potential, I think the Cúrlach mentioned that there is a bit of a dynamic that's happening between delivering appropriate densities and being able to deliver affordable units. The cost of the unit is key in terms of affordability, and the higher, denser schemes do seem to cost more. So that's something we're working out. Different parts of Fingal have different affordability issues. The likes of the Castleland sites in Balbriggan that will be developed by the Land Development Agency does have potential to deliver affordable units without much need for discounts in terms of the land value being brought to the table. But that will be worked through over the coming year. What we're saying, I suppose, the first thing to get right is to master plan the site, know what should be on the site, what can be developed on the site, and that's in line with the potential constraints of that site. So that's why we focus very much on ensuring that there's a framework in place, and that framework will be used by ourselves where we're developing directly, but also by the Land Development Agency when they progress the sites that they're involved in. I think there's some social housing questions that I'll ask my colleague Ms Egan to answer.
Thank you, Emery. In relation to the Part 5 delivery, I suppose I would agree with my colleague from South Dublin. In Fingal, the delivery of Part 5, in general, we find that we were getting delivery pretty much up front from developers. And again, as Ms Farley referenced, the bigger sites and the more sites that we have, the more opportunities for that. In terms of taking the land ourselves, we would have similar difficulties to South Dublin in terms of the procurement issue around that, the development of it, bringing on for development. So in Fingal, we don't have a difficulty in terms of early delivery from our Part 5. And we would have, since 2015, we've about, and to the end of this year, we will have approximately 300 units delivered through the Part 5 process. And if you take the planning permissions and the active sites already there across the county, we will have another 1,000 to 1,200 Part 5 units being delivered as those planning permissions are worked through. So in terms of Part 5, I think taking the land wouldn't be beneficial in Fingal. To answer the Chair's questions in terms of downsizing and older persons, in Fingal we have a number of older persons accommodation schemes being worked through at the moment, so we're hoping to bring those forward through the Part 8 process within the coming year. And we're working very closely with the approved housing bodies, particularly those who are specialised in that type of delivery. So we would hope that we would be encouraging also for people in larger local authority housing to downsize if possible and where possible into those homes as well. And obviously the incentive, apart from any other incentives that may be brought in, would be that people will be moving into a new property much more efficient to live in and to operate in. So that would be the benefits there. The AHBs, in terms of approved housing bodies, we work very proactively with all of the AHBs across the spectrum, but in particular the main Tier 3 approved housing bodies. And we would have a number of our sites have been given to AHBs. We have one about to start on site in Mulhuddart for 64 units with Clwyd. That will be in December of this year, and then we're working with two other significant sites within the county. So we're working very proactively with the approved housing bodies. And in terms of cost rental, again, similarly, we're working with the approved housing bodies in terms of where we could bring in cost rental into our schemes into the future. But again, we would await, I suppose, the experience of the pilot schemes that are underway at the moment and the introduction of a scheme. But having said that, we're working alongside those. I think that might be it. Thank you.
Ms Egan, Ms Harty.
Thank you, Chair. I might respond to some of them and ask my colleague Brian Gainey then to come in on some of the others. So I suppose the first one's in relation to the Land Development Agency. It's an interesting question. Thank you for asking it. I think that the Land Development Agency can bring added value in the sense of dealing with the other agencies in the first instance from our perspective by the fact of its establishment, where it sits in the context of being set up legally. I think that will be really important in bringing some of those other lands that we've identified in our statement, and they will have have far better chances of success, I think, because of its status. So that would be an added value that I think that I would see from the Land Development Agency. Deputy Barry asked, he spoke there a little bit about underutilised private lands and also why are people not living in Cork City. I suppose in relation to Cork City itself, a lot of the underutilised private lands, and that probably links into this piece that both deputies picked up on, where we said in appropriate circumstances that underutilised lands, that there may be some issues there, and that's very much about people sitting on land and land holding, maybe have bought at the right price, some people have bought at the wrong price, we fully respect that, and then actually causing a rise in land values, which is actually adding to the cost of housing. So I think that's where that connects in. I suppose in relation to Cork City itself, one of the impediments, I believe, to why people aren't living in Cork City is that it didn't have a boundary extension for 50 years, and therefore how things developed around the city was a donut of greenfield development. I think as well the attractiveness of urban living has changed in society very recently, and I think that the ask and the want to live now in a city location, especially a central city location, is becoming stronger, and that looks for a different type of solution. So they're kind of so in relation to the comment in relation to the Constitution, we do have things like derelict site, vacant sites, tools available to us, but there are, they are slow to progress, and there may be on occasion some sites that need a different solution. So that's where we were coming from. Brian, can I?
Okay, thanks, Anne. Sorry, just to go through the various questions. Deputy Barry, I can make available, I suppose, as the Chair has outlined, the profile of our housing list. And to answer Deputy Barrett's question, it's 3,872 are the approved list of applicants in Cork City Council's housing list from the September figure. It's fair to say, I suppose, on waiting times, then when there was little or no activity for nearly a 10-year period, that obviously waiting times are substantial, and you've outlined some of those time periods today. That wouldn't be exceptional from what you've outlined, but we can make it in terms of the waiting times that you've outlined.
Would you say that 8 years on the list would not be exceptional?
It would. No.
Would 10?
Depending on the area of the city that you're looking for. What we do find, I suppose, in terms of the housing list, we have around just over 2,600 people that are actively engaging with our choice-based letting system, but people will at times wait for the area and the offer that they want. And we find that in particular on maybe homeless refusals. We've 32 refusals of accommodation to date this year for people that are currently in emergency accommodation. 32 refusals to date, yeah. So I suppose just the Chair's questions just on downsizing. Cork City Council will complete a 30-unit scheme this year for downsizing, which will be used for local authority houses that are currently under-occupied. And we have a financial contribution scheme in place for private homeowners. So our intention is under our housing programme to develop more of those going forward, and there is a substantial demand in the city for that. Just on design teams and our own, we'll say, programme delivery teams, certainly we've augmented resources over the last 12 to 18 months, and as projects are coming through the system, project costs are being made available to the local authorities. So I think we're now satisfied that we have adequate resources in place to go forward with a very substantial construction programme. We have just over 1,200 units in our project pipeline at the moment. 345 of those are currently under construction, and over 200 will be completed in the current year. We have very active engagement with the AHB sector. All the major AHBs are met on a bi-monthly basis. We also have a memorandum of understanding in place with them that as development opportunities are coming up, that AHBs aren't competing with each other, nor are they competing with the local authority. Just on cost rental, our own council approved a very substantial scheme of 112 units at Blackpool, recently, and we are looking at a mixture of social and affordable rental at that location with the Housing Association involved. The comment, I suppose, in terms of, from the chairperson, in terms of brownfield sites. So in the city, we have 16 sites under construction at the moment. I suppose a lack of greenfield sites currently in the city. So we very much rely on sites that deliver 10, 15, 20 units. And a lot of those going on at the moment. And as I said, 345 of those currently under construction. Just on approval processes, obviously you're all aware of the 4-stage approval processes, and I think, look, timelines have improved. I would say that as a practitioner in this area for some time, and certainly we're making good progress with the department on various projects that we put before them. Part 5 delivery, I suppose, as the Chief Executive has alluded to earlier in the opening statement, is very slow in Cork because the majority of construction is either in social housing or in student accommodation, where Part 5 does not apply. Thank you.
Right. Ms Keenan.
Okay, in terms of John Leary-Rattan, we would have 4,500 on the housing list. Quite a considerable amount of those households would also be on others housing lists, so I would expect the real figure to be more in the region of around 3,000. We have 320 people on RAS and probably similar on HAP. One of the things I think that often isn't taken into account is the relets that happen every year. So while it's not all about new construction or acquisitions, we have in John Leary would have about 150 relets every year, so people will obviously get those from the social housing list. We're also working with approved housing bodies in partnership with them, and we're currently working with them to develop 209 homes, so that's quite considerable. In terms of the LDA, we're open to working with them, obviously when we have further information, but I would welcome the additionality that will come as part of that, particularly in terms of the Central Mental Hospital in Dundrum, which is in our area, and there's potential there for an additional 600 social and affordable homes. In terms of affordability, obviously John Leary-Rattan, there's a huge affordability issue, and it's extremely important for us to develop affordable units on our own land. So I think while Deputy Barrett was suggesting maybe that it would all be social, I think, I would believe that the right mix there is certainly social and affordable because of the affordability issues that pertain particularly to John Leary-Rattan. In terms of Part 5, we've secured, I think, in the region of 170 since 2015, and I will pass over to my colleague Mary Henchy, who will discuss the query on bringing the land up front.
Deputy, you referenced particularly Cherrywood, and have you considered a site like Cherrywood and bringing forward one site for 800 units by the local authority rather than waiting for individuals? And I suppose I would concur with a lot of what my colleagues from the other local authorities have said, that, you know, and I think you know yourself from golf course lands in Dún Laoghaire, it hasn't been the case that social housing has come last, it's actually come up front, and this is all part of the negotiations. But the other thing that there's a couple of other points that I'd like to make, and one is that in a scheme like Cherrywood, where you're talking about higher density housing, you'll actually achieve more by working with the totality of the landholding rather than splitting off elements of it. Also, we have circa 10 different landowners within Cherrywood, so as to combine all of those and do one site between all of them would be a negotiation outside of what is facilitated by Part 5, where it's site-specific, dependent on the planning application being lodged, and where you know, the permission only comes into play when it commences. So it would be a different set of rules, I think, around what you're asking than what are around Part 5.
One brief supplementary.
Yeah. If that's all right. That's your finished, Barrett. Eoin.
Thanks very much, and thanks, folks, for the answers. I suppose one of the concerns about the Land Development Agency is, while many of us are fully supportive of it as a strategic land management agency in terms of moving around public land, it's the bit of its function around residential housing development that concerns us, partly because some of us do take a side on the issue of councils, because we think councils would be better placed to be given the powers and money to deliver it, but also because of the model that's been used. So I have a couple of kind of technical questions just to help I suppose we understand some of that stuff. But to emphasise the worry that some of us have is that if the Land Development Agency develops as the initial outline of it is being proposed, my fear is that local authorities will be reduced primarily to developing infill and small social housing developments or working with approved housing bodies and then managing the growing stock. And I think that's a real concern. So I suppose, Colm, in terms of your own direct experience of the joint venture or other folks who have, can you compare the kind of timelines involved for a joint venture versus a comparable size project if it was just local authority led? Still mixed income and mixed tenure, but because they're very different types of processes, and is one faster than the other? Is one more complex or cumbersome than the other? The other thing is, and I'm interested in people's views, one of the discussions we had with the Land Development Agency earlier is whether or not the tenure mix, the exact breakdown of the tenure mix in a joint venture, is really determined by the financing requirements of the overall package rather than the social affordable housing need in a particular area. And I'm just wondering, do you have a view on that? And also, given that delivering affordable housing within the joint venture context is kind of complex because there's lots of different funding dropped in there, so you're going to have maybe some service sites fund, you'll have the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan. Does that not just make it inherently more complex than, for example, local authorities in a development of their own, building houses in the traditional way and then renting and selling them out to people on different income thresholds as affordable purchase or affordable rent? In terms of the service sites loan, I mean, obviously one of the changes to it, if I understand it right, is this business of the equity stake. So if I understand it right, there's a 40 or 50,000 euro subsidy, although 25% of that has to be covered by the local authorities, and I'm not sure if the money is there for that. But does adding this equity stake complicate it above and beyond the existing O'Coulon model that I'm sure you're all aware of? And also, does that 40 or 50,000 euros meet the costs both of the site servicing and offsetting the cost of the land for the council in many of your sites? The other thing that was talked about in the budget, and it's relevant to this discussion, is changing the financial threshold for the one-stage approval process to whatever it is, 7 million. My understanding is that process adds a significant additional level of liabilities on the local authority, which is one of the reasons why local authorities aren't keen on it. And maybe if you could talk us through that a little bit. And even if there weren't those liabilities, the 7 million threshold, it's still for very small projects, so if it is of much use. On the compulsory purchase orders, I suppose one of the questions I was asking, and again, I appreciate if you feel that it's not possible to answer it, but for example, local authorities have CPO powers. The problem is, unless the department is giving you the funding and the political backing to go and CPO a garage of Dublin Bus or a bit of the docks from Cork Docklands, then you can't do it, I presume. So can you just confirm to the committee, what is it that would stop, for example, Cork going out tomorrow and CPOing some of those large sites that you've identified on your report? And then a couple of you mentioned working with the Land Development Agency. I get the first bit of that in terms of they acquire land and then come to you and say, well, let's develop this together. My worry, and if you guys can explain how you think this might work, is if you have the land and the Land Development Agency comes to you, and how that will work. I mean, okay, you'd be involved in the master planning, but would it then be handed over to the Land Development Agency for a joint venture with a private developer? Or, I know it's early stages, but have you any thoughts on that? And then finally, on the Cork cost rental, that's very interesting. I'd be really interested to know what the financing model for it is and where you are at in terms of establishing kind of rent setting, whether it's a single rent, whether there'll be several banded rents. I know Dublin City Council are exploring these things at the minute, so any information you have on that would be interesting. And finally then on the relets, I accept relets are part of it, but they're such a small number, just given the nature of the stock, that in terms of the net overall churn, they're not huge, but you're right, they're there. And on the Central Mental Hospital, I suppose, yes, 600 social affordable units would be fantastic, but given that that site will hold 1,500 units, am I wrong? Wouldn't it be much, much better to have a really great, or a number of great mixed income, mixed tenure, social affordable rental and affordable sale units? Because then you wouldn't just have 600, you'd have 1,500, and surely that would be a better outcome in terms of you meeting social affordable housing need.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think that Anne Doherty has pinpointed a really important issue. It's an important issue nationally, but it's a big issue in the Cork City area when she talks about land hoarding, and she talks about land hoarding on such a scale that it's causing a rise in land values. What are the knock-on effects? Housing shortage, land isn't being utilised. The shortage then causes increase in the price of housing, and the increase in the price of housing links in with an increase in rent, including big increases in rent. This is something that needs to be focused on, because what is going on here is, in my opinion, it's criminal. It might not be breaking the law of the land, but it's in anyone's moral code, it's criminal in the midst of the greatest housing crisis in the history of this state that there are wealthy individuals further enriching themselves by this activity. And it needs to be tackled. And that's one of the reasons why I welcome the comments she made earlier on about examining protections currently afforded to private property in the Constitution. Compulsory purchase orders have been mentioned. I make it clear that I'm not in favour here necessarily of just limiting ourselves to compulsory purchase orders, which end up with the land being acquired, you pay top dollar market rates for it. I think some of these people who've profiteered from land hoarding of this kind, the idea of the state acquiring that land through something nowhere near top dollar market rates, is something in the interest of society and in the interest of people who are suffering during this housing crisis. I noted very carefully the comments of Brian Gainey in relation to 8 years on the housing waiting list not being at all exceptional in Cork. I think we might get a breakdown of those figures. It would be very interesting to get. I suspect that when we go into when we look at them in a forensic way, that we'll probably see that 10 years or 12 years isn't particularly exceptional either. And then, of course, we have the affordability issue. The examples I gave: firefighters, nurses, teachers not able to afford to buy in Cork City itself. So we get down to brass tacks then. We have public land. Now, not a lot of it in the ownership of the council. The last big council land bank is the old Whitechurch Road. I think, given the points that have been made about affordability and people being locked out of the market, even people on average wages, and given the idea of a social housing waiting list with, you know, nearly 4,000 people on it, where 8 years on the list is not at all exceptional. The idea of using those public lands 100% for public housing, by which I mean council housing and housing where the state contracts a builder and then provides at cost price, genuinely affordable for working people, is what clearly needs to be done. Now, I was going to say I have a concern. I'm completely opposed to this Land Development Agency ratio of 60, 30, 10. If you were to do 60, 30, 10 on the old Whitechurch Road, I'm going to ask you a question about this in a moment, right? What it would mean is that if you had 600 houses, 360 would be market rates, which is affordable for very many. 180 would be what the government defines as affordable, which is market rate minus maybe 50,000, which is still unaffordable for certainly young people coming out of college and working a couple of years, but I think also older workers on the average wage, and 10% social, which would be 60 when you've got a housing waiting list of nearly 4,000, and as we said, many people waiting for 10 years or more. So I have a direct question for Brian: is what is the envisaged mix on the old Whitechurch Road as an example of public lands in Cork? Yeah, and why would we not say 100% public housing, council housing and genuinely affordable houses on that sites and sites such as that? And my final question is, there was a long list of sites provided by the speakers from Cork City Council, HSE, ESB, Éireann Road Éireann, Port of Cork, Borden and Mona, Department of Defence. I mean, one of the biggest concentration of state-owned lands outside of local authority control in the state is in the Cork area. A lot of it is NAMA, not exclusively. So I think the Land Development Agency is being set up in such a way that those public lands will be privatised with at least 60% going to developers with market rates. I would love to see a situation where the likes of Cork City Council could play a key central role in building on those lands and overseeing 100% public housing, social and genuinely affordable, because clearly the need is there for it. And I'm wondering if the speakers from the City Council might like to comment on that.
Yeah. Look, I know there was a lot of questions for everybody, so I'm not criticising for not giving an answer, but I do think it is actually worth getting an answer to just dramatise the problem we're facing on waiting times in Dún Laoghaire, because they're shocking. 8 years is shocking, but they're really, really shocking in Dún Laoghaire, right? And that then relates to the question about the plans for direct public housing provision by the local authority itself. Yeah. And you see, I accept we need affordable housing, Catherine. Of course we do, right? Because people who aren't eligible for the list have to be housed, and even more so when median prices are 527,000, as you said, in Dún Laoghaire, right? But the question is, if we are going to meet the demand to reduce those shockingly high lists, it just seems to me that what is planned in terms of council housing provision just cannot impact in any significant way on those lists. Because on a site where we could have got 500 and whatever, we're going to get 200. And after Shangana, I don't see where the rest is coming from. I mean, I think you said there's 197 coming down the line. We'll get relets, 150. Part 5s, wasn't quite clear what we hoped to get there. But you add it all up, maybe 1,500 over the next 2 or 3 years, if we're lucky, in terms of council housing, against a list that is 12, 15, 16, 17 years people are waiting, right? So I just don't see how we're going to get anywhere close. And in those years, intervening years, we're going to get more people joining the list, which will reduce further, if you like, the impact on that list. Now, to me, we have to have a plan to house everybody on that list. And we don't. So therefore, it seems to me we have to significantly ramp up so one way or another, we have to ramp up the planned provision of public housing. And so I'd just like you to sort of, answer that. And I know part of this is to do with government policy and all the rest of it, but it just seems to me that that is a statement of the obvious fact that we're not going to be able to meet the housing need in terms of public housing. And then on the affordable housing, haven't we a real dilemma? I mean, you're alluding to it, you've got to be careful what you say, but if affordable is 50,000 off average price, and average price or median price in Dún Laoghaire is 527,000, affordable, it means nothing in Dún Laoghaire. It's complete nonsense. We can't, on that basis, we cannot deliver affordable housing on Shangana or anywhere else. Right? So we have to have another scheme, but clearly the government scheme cannot deliver affordable housing on that basis of 50,000 minus that price. Right? And could you also answer, to what extent is that conundrum slowing up Shangana, and is it likely to slow up other sites? In other words, how do we get the affordable that we want to get? Well, we can't get it because it's totally unaffordable, right? And also, could you clarify as well, because you reference in your thing that we have to consider as part of the, what did you call it, the public spending code, we have to consider PPP. Could you elaborate that? right? I want to know what that means. So does that mean when we're looking at Shanganagh, you've got to consider possibility of selling off part of Shanganagh in order to finance the rest, to finance the affordable, and the public housing, because that's a mess. That's a mess, right? And therefore, in that context, wouldn't it be easier to just build the council houses? Because then we just have to go to the department and say, we're building 500 council houses. Maybe we need to vary the scheme of eligibility for it. Maybe we can even decide our own affordable afterwards. But that mess, it seems to me, is inevitable, is it not, delaying the whole process? And lastly, for Mary on Cherrywood, right? Okay, I take your point, but isn't it fair to say we have no control over when stuff is going to be delivered there? None at all. We're completely at the mercy of the people. I mean, Hines have just flipped on some of the land to Cairn, and we know that Cairn have told their own shareholders they're drip feeding stuff to keep the price up. They've actually told their shareholders, we're going to drip feed stuff. We're not going to build it all out. We're going to drip feed it to keep up the value of the property and to keep the dividends flowing to our shareholders, right? And isn't it fair to say we have absolutely no control over that? And what I'm asking is there anything we can do to sort of get hold of that process? And even on the bit that has got planning permission, you can remind me, Mary, how the planning permission that did go through the with Hines, was it 1,200? It's starting at the end of the month. When are we getting the part 5 on that? Is that coming up front? And at what price are we paying for it? Has that been negotiated yet? Because there was prices being bandied around that Hines were going to sell them back to the council for like up to 430,000 back to the council on land that NAMA had originally sold to them. You know, can you give us any further information on that?
Richard, and I might just suggest it might be worth Richard's while, mine, Victor, just the Dunleary people that are in here, that we might have a meeting again with you about Cherrywood, because it's so vast. Needless to say, the big plot of the quadrant that we have up there and what's going to happen as well. So there's huge scope, and the amount of LIHAF funding and everything's getting, so it might merit us meeting Dunleary separately on that, and I would welcome it if we could initiate that. On the other aspect, the date of the design team. Do you have a date of when the design team was appointed?
The design team, actually, that's the one I was saying, it would take about 9 months. We expect it to be completed in May, so they're probably about a month into it at this stage.
Okay, so May is...
May 2019,
May.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, and I just wanted to mention that I also welcome, I know Cork referenced it there as well, the amount of student accommodation that's coming on stream, and I know the fast track planning has facilitated that as well, and the amount of student accommodation that's coming on stream or has been built is very much welcomed, because it takes them out of the private rental sector, which eases that for us as well, and that it's also recognised in the CSO figures, because it's shared accommodation. It doesn't come under the principal builds, so it's never really included, but there is a huge volume coming through there. When it comes to affordability, this is where I disagree with Richard on this. Affordability is on the cost of the land and the cost of the development. It's not necessarily what the average price is in that area. So we can have different figures around that on different sites around, but there was a substantial proposal put in by the Dunleary councillors, by John Bailey, Michael Merrigan, Eoin O'Brien, supported by the 40 councillors in Dunleary, that looked at affordable purchase, affordable rent to buy, and social housing and step-down housing for older people. And why that concept will have to be tweaked in some shape or form to make it happen. Where exactly are we with that? Notwithstanding the design team, where exactly are we with that scheme between the department and the local authority? Because there's mixed responses that we're getting back on that one. And when it comes to appropriate use of land, the Mount Anvil Depot in Goatstown, have we a scheme coming forward on that site? And while I'd have ideas around that site, and I know other things that are happening around that site, I would be loath to sell any piece of state land in an area like that when we have an affordability crisis. And it would just be ideal for the cost rental model or the affordable purchase model. So I'd be loath and against any sale of a piece of state land in an area which is hugely resourced by infrastructure and with accessibility to the facilities that are around that. I just wanted to put that on the record. But having a scheme for that site, and on the other sites that we have, the schemes, I know Dundrum is hugely important, but I'd rather see us deliver Shangana first before we start to dilute the resources we have looking at Dundrum. So while Dundrum will be welcomed, the focus has to be on the Shankill site first. But again, I would welcome a separate meeting on Cherrywood, because I think it's too complex for in here, and we'd want to get into far greater detail, and Cherrywood wasn't what you were coming in for, to be fair. But just some detailed answers around that would be welcomed. Colm? Happy to facilitate, Richard. Colm.
Model. I mean, we've been through a complex process involving 2 years of master planning, getting down to the nitty-gritty of what the community will be like, but also the supporting surveys to de-risk the planning process. So that has taken 2 years, but has provided certainty where now we have the preferred bidder who, all going well and working to the timeline we've discussed, they'll be on site in June, right? So 2.5 year, 2.75 year process to get on site. If we were to manage design, approval and so on, and permission for something similar, I couldn't quite quantify. I think we'd manage it in tracts, and I don't think it'd be comparing like with like. I don't think we would envisage a scheme where we would have the resources to manage the complexity of 1,000+ units, and I think we're not going to be able to compare the two. I do think that in terms of affordability, you're going to have to go to the market at some stage to determine what price homes are going to be built for. So the market will determine that, and then the affordability is a question of a percentage of that or a fixed amount of that, and there's variabilities. Obviously in South Dublin we have a different consideration to DLR, and we look to apply an appropriate percentage, but we're very much aware of that. It brings in the Service Sites Fund and offsetting costs, and we've signalled our intent to utilise that fund in 2019 on the 4 large sites that I mentioned. How that will work out, and we'd probably have some concerns about what happens to the land that we put in and whether we'll get full value back for that. So we have to work that out fully with the department, but it is a concern, absolutely. In the overall context of impact, we've outlined 800 own build units. Relets brings approximately 200 per annum. So 800 if we're talking 2021 as a time frame. We've Part 5s 500 units, AHBs approximately 400. We've our large sites which will yield in the thousands. Then you look at people who will be on the housing list and who will graduate to affordable housing when the schemes are on stream as well. So suddenly you're getting to a large number that starts encroaching significantly on the 7,055 on our housing list. So just, there is a bigger picture view of trying to meet that target and trying to accelerate delivery of the required numbers. In terms of the department's approval process and the move from the one-stage approval process to 7 million, we haven't utilised the 2 million approval process up to now. We'll certainly look at 7 million because it brings in a lot more scope for us to look at that, and we'll certainly see what the detail of the revised procedures will be. In South Dublin, the LDA haven't identified any sites in our administrative area. Certainly we don't see them having a role in the sites that we have identified, and we're progressing to master plan, and we're going with that, and our master plans will be ready in the first quarter of next year for those sites. So I don't think the LDA will have a responsibility in those sites, and we're working ahead on them on the premise that their focus is not on local authority land. So that's the premise we're working on. We'll see if it works out differently, but that's the premise we're working on, Chair. So that's, I think, from our point of view, okay.
Right. Just generally on the Land Development Agency, again, I don't see it either being involved in the local authority owned sites. I think the local authority can progress those sites itself, unless it needs additional resources, which I think the Land Development Agency has said it can offer if needs be. But I suppose their involvement in a county, particularly where there's non-local authority public lands, their assistance in that regard will help bring those lands to development, you know, where they can engage with those other public bodies and ensure that land is made available. I suppose I don't see it necessarily being a complicating factor who the end purchaser of the unit is. I think it's welcome that the Land Development Agency is proposing to fund the development of some sites. I see it basically who is paying the development cost. If it's the private sector, you're necessarily in that procurement process, the joint venture, the PPPs. There's no avoiding that. If it's public money, then you can obviously go more direct to market and engage with the market to build the units itself, and ultimately decide then how those units are used, whether sold on or used as social housing. So I think we can work well with the Land Development Agency, but I don't see them becoming involved in developing out the local authority-owned lands. There is merit in terms of continuing with the sustainable communities approach. I think the mix of private, affordable and social is a good mix and has proven to work historically. I think the increase in the number of sites will increase the delivery and the supply of units involved in that. There are some questions there about social housing and the approval process. I'll ask Ms Egan to come in on. But more generally, I think it is about activating land, and we all need to use our joint resources to ensure that happens.
And just on the approval process, similar to South Dublin, Fingal haven't used the one-stage process up to now, which has a limit of 2 million. Because it has a limit of 2 million, and most of our schemes are above that threshold. But we would welcome the new one-stage process being extended up to 7 million, and certainly we'd be exploring that and making full use of it where applicable. So we welcome it. You know. Thank you.
Anne.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to the question about the CPO, I just might just flip it just for 1 second. I do believe that the public lands we've identified here, I don't think a CPO process is the right way to go about it. I do think having an independent land development agency actually could bring huge value to addressing some of this. I think it's got an independence, and it has a benefit to actually realise these lands are owned in the main, obviously, as you can see, by some state and semi-state organisations. So I do think that there is a better merit there, because I think if we go down a CPO route, we'll actually end up costing the taxpayer a lot more. We have used CPO in our city very much around dereliction, and as we've said previously, we don't have a load of land available in private ownership. So I do think, in relation to local authority building, local authority houses, I think that and I did put it in our statement, that we just need to be careful that we don't address short-term needs, and I appreciate how serious they are, but there is a longer-term game here, and it's a societal game. So local authorities, I think, have a huge role in sustainable development, as my colleague here said, but also in proper urban design and planning. I mentioned previously about the growth in the population of Cork city and suburbs of 115,000 people. That's 70,000 jobs. These workers are not all going to be Irish. They are going to be from across the world, and they do need a solution to their housing needs, and not all of that is ownership. It is an affordable rent for them as well. So I do think that local authorities have a wider role than just providing the units, and I do think that's really, really important, and I would urge us all not to forget that. I think that probably covers most of my piece. I might ask Brian to address some of the others, if that's okay.
Thanks. Sorry, just back to Deputy O'Brien's comments, just to start off with our question, sorry. Just in relation to, we wouldn't have used, we'll say, joint venture to date at the scale of what Dublin has done, but where we have entered into joint ventures, we've used the competitive dialogue process in Cork on 11 sites, and we would have used Part 8, our own Part 8, and approval by the members on 8 of those sites. So our experience with that in terms of timelines has been very positive by and large. For example, the 30-unit scheme that I referred to earlier for downsizing, that had Part 8 approval last year by our own members on the 31st of July, and will be delivered before year end. So a good timeline and good experience on that. Just in terms of the Service Sites Fund, the main project that we've made an application for there, Boherboy Road, we're lucky in that we don't have any, we've no land debt on that site. We have some design costs, but I suppose sales prices haven't been determined yet. But we are obviously going to have to go to the market on that and hope that the funding is approved through that fund. But still, the local authority, yes, does need to come up with that 25%, which obviously will pose some difficulties for us. Like South Dublin and Fingal, Cork City Council has not availed of the 2 million single stage process for the reasons outlined earlier. Just on cost rental, again, we're looking at that with the Housing Association in Blackpool. Rents being looked at, I suppose, due to the volume of social housing on the site, that some of them could be made available for cost rental, but you're probably looking at 25 to 30% maybe under market value on that site.
Single rent or bands of rents?
Bands of rents is what is actually be looked at, depending on household income information. Just on Deputy Barry, just in terms of the significant land holding at Old Whitechurch Road, you're aware that Part 8 has now been advertised to carry out the major infrastructural works on the site. That will go before our own members before the end of 2018. And if approved, we did intend to carry out the enabling works on the site. I suppose what I can say here today is that yes, there will be social and affordable housing on the site, but I think it would be wrong of me that we would have that debate with respect to this committee here today. That I think that's a debate that we should have in our own council chamber. But we acknowledge the comments that you've made. Sorry, Deputy Bailey, in terms of student accommodation, yes, you're correct in terms of the large-scale student accommodation currently under construction. That is freeing up units in the private sector, which is a welcome development.
Thank you, Brian. Catherine?
Okay, in terms of Deputy O'Brien's question there in regard to the LDA, I think if we are developing our own sites and at the same time the LDA are developing sites such as Dundrum, then the social and affordable could come quicker, which is obviously to be welcomed. In terms of the waiting times in Dillor, I think are approximately 10 years, but I can clarify that. In terms of delivery, I think some of the options that haven't been mentioned would be HAP and RAS and leasing. So there are other options, and these are options that a lot of our households, our tenants actually want. So that will help with the entire delivery programme. In terms of Part 5, we're currently negotiating 43 Part 5 sites, which will deliver 498 units. In terms of Shangana, it is about affordability on our own lands and not about the market price of affordability in terms of Shangana. We are currently working with the NDFA looking at funding options. As part of that, I am obliged to look at a PPP with the NDFA, but that doesn't mean that that's the outcome. That's just part of what I have to do. I'm obliged to do that. I mean, while we all might have an intuitive feel that social and affordable is the right thing to do, I still have to do what I have to do in terms of the procedure. So we're waiting the outcome of that. But in the meantime, we didn't hold back. In the meantime, what we did was we went to the design team to progress with the master plan. So we're not holding back on Shangana in any way. I think that's about it.
Have we gone back to the local authority yet? Where are we between the department and the local authority?
Well, we're working with the NDFA, and in terms of the local authority, in terms of the elected members, we have agreed to have a workshop with them at the beginning of November.
But they haven't. This is the first time it'll go back to the councillors since.
Well, we've had a number of meetings, but in terms of looking at options and developing that out, we're not there yet, but we hope to come back to them in the beginning of November.
Okay. And if possible, I don't know if Richard wants to, if possible, that the elected member, the TDs might be invited to that as well, or even, I'll leave that up to you to make a decision on that.
Can I ask just a question on that, on the value for money exercise very quickly?
Yeah, and the Mount Amble site, is there any scheme, because it's a service site, is there a scheme at all?
Scheme. No.
So we do still have service sites with no schemes coming forward. I know that site's a bit more complicated,
yes.
but there's no scheme in train for that?
There isn't, no.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Eoin.
It's just a technical question, and it's as much to understand the logic of the value for money exercise as it is the Shangana. So you have to go through your cost approvals with regular projects. For anything over to 20 million, you have to go through this value for money exercise, and then you still have to go out to the market and tender and allow the market to set the prices for the build. It just seems like the value for money exercise makes no sense, in the sense that there's already checks and balances in terms of the costs of it. From your understanding, what is the purpose or the logic of the value for money exercise, and how much time does it add? If for example, Shangana, if the FTA value for money exercise comes back and says, that's fine, go with the proposal that's on the table from the elected members and yourselves, how much time has that added to the overall development time frame? Because it just seems kind of unnecessary. I know you're not going to say that you think it's unnecessary, although I saw a glint in your eye as you kept telling us how often you had to do it. So you probably do think it's unnecessary, but...
No, I mean, I suppose, as I said earlier, when I talked about that, I was talking about an intuitive feel that you might have. But obviously, there are procedures in terms of value for money that you have to do. But in terms of, I mean, we have been a number of months at this, but it hasn't held us back, because at the same time, we're working in tandem. So at the same time, we have appointed the design team to do the work, and we tendered for the design team before that. Well, not if you continue like we started the process when we at the same time we were tendering for the design team, and then we've appointed the design team. So we're still in that process, but it's in tandem. So we couldn't move ahead without.
Can you go to stage one approval application with the department while the value for money is being considered?
No, well, you could alert them, and you could look
but you can't start the formal approval process.
But you wouldn't get stage one approval unless you have looked at the various options. Yes.
But can you start the stage one approval process while the NDFA is still doing the value for money exercise with you?
Start the stage one.
You know, the point where you go to the department and say you'd like to initiate the stage one approval process for the project.
Well, you would have discussions with the department about what your proposals might be, but you wouldn't get approval until you've looked at all the options and until you've done the value for money exercise. Yeah.
We'll do a quick fire, one last question, then we're
what is the discussion that you're having with the NDFA? Because, you know, you and me can sit down and have a discussion now. It takes like an hour or two. We have our discussion and then we move on, right? What are you discussing? What's the sticking point with the NDFA?
Well, it wouldn't be just discussions, obviously, because it's about modelling different options around funding opportunities. So it's not just discussions. Obviously, we come back and forth with, so they would help us with that. So that's the National Development Finance Agency. So they're there to advise us on various options. So.
Yeah, but I mean, see, this is, in other words, it has to be turning on the question of affordability and how you pay for affordability given the market prices. And then you're saying we've got to consider PPP, and if we don't like it, I mean, what does that mean? And what does that consideration involve? Because my frustration in this is, if we just built the houses, we just have to go to the department and say, here's our scheme, give us the money for the houses. Whereas instead we're going through this process, which I don't fully understand. I don't understand what these modellings are, but they seem to essentially revolve around the fact that there's this insistence that we consider PPP, and we have to figure out the finances of affordable in the particular context of Dún Laoghaire, where it's difficult to do. I mean, when does this end, like?
Well, one of the options is to consider a PPP, but you know, or a joint venture, or we might look at an SPV or whatever, or ways to fund the affordability, because obviously there still could be a subsidy required or whatever, so we might have to look at how we might look at that, whether we can borrow to do that, and what effect that might have on the overall balance sheet. So there's various different things, so it's not just a discussion, I suppose.
Does anybody apply value for money to the NDFA itself? You don't have to answer it. A flippant end of meeting comment.
Just final short question for Brian is in relation to the Old Whitechurch Road site. There's a debt on that site. Was it the housing agency purchased in order to stop it falling into the hands of the private sector, but it was at the height of the Celtic Tiger, so I think it's in the region of 30 million. Obviously, if Cork City Council is to deliver affordable housing on that site, one of the things that will need to be dealt with is the question of that debt. I think it should be written off. I think the Council's position is that it should be negotiated downwards, but has there been any progress in relation to that, and is there any information you can provide us with on that front?
Thank you, Chair. Deputy, yeah, I suppose just in terms of the overall debt on the land, it was the majority of the land was purchased by compulsory purchase order, and the valuation on the land was set through the independent arbitration process. I suppose in terms of the scheme progressing, okay, I think our approach to date has been to deliver the enabling works and to get the scheme to a position that we're publicly advertising it. And once the master planning process and that is completed, we will look obviously and see what can be done with the debt at that stage. But it is obviously a major challenge to the council in terms of the overall debt for a project that might deliver 600 homes.
Final question. I'm not answering Richard's question or facilitating, but just to concur with what he's saying there, while we disagree again with the makeup of the site, the scheme that was proposed by the 40 councillors in Healy-Rae went through various framework options that are there over a year ago, costed, how it was going to be funded, financial. I mean, it was a substantial document that was submitted from the 40 councillors, in principle from the 3 councillors mentioned earlier. And it's a year on, but I haven't actually seen why that doesn't work in principle. So I actually look forward to that workshop that is going to happen. But it's a year on, and I stood on that site well over a year ago, and coming from 12 years in a local authority like Richard, like we've vast understanding of the complexities involved in delivering social housing in local authorities, but the feedback we haven't really received on that Changana site to the level that we should receive. I'm not blaming people. We're just trying to get answers to move it forward, that's all. But and Healy-Rae is well resourced when we look at our capital programme, when we look at what we take in local property tax, when we look at the proportion of that goes into housing of the 18 million. Like, we're in a good position in that place. So I look forward to really in-depth responses during that workshop programme, and hopefully you'll facilitate a meeting with Cherry would as well. But members, can I ask you just to stay? We just have to do 1 minute of a private session as well. But can I thank all the witnesses who attended today, and some had to travel a little further than others, and for the detailed statements that you issued us with. And if there is anything further that you want to send on to us, we'd be delighted to receive it. But these kind of engagements really help us when we're going through policy, and when we're questioning the department as well, on the other hand as well. So can I thank you very much for your attendance, and sorry to delay you this morning. We were actually going well over, but it was a really interesting discussion, so thank you very much for your attendance. Members, I propose we just go into private session just for 2 minutes for some housekeeping matters. Is that agreed? Thanks.